They say you never forget the moment your family stops being your family. For me, it was the sound of my father's fist slamming the table so hard the wine glasses shattered. The word he screamed, "Get out!" didn't just echo through that dining room. It tore through 35 years of sacrifice of being the daughter who gave up everything so they could have more. I looked around that table. My stepmother wouldn't meet my eyes. My sister Madison. She smiled. Even my own mother, the woman who gave birth to me, sat there in stone-cold silence. They wanted me gone. All of them. And I finally understood why. See, they thought I was weak. They thought I'd beg, cry, plead for forgiveness for sins I never committed. But I didn't say a word. I walked out of that house, got in my car, and drove through the night. And when the sun came up the next morning, I signed the deed to a $20 million oceanfront mansion paid in full that I didn't even know I owned. My grandmother, God rest her soul, had been playing chess while they were playing checkers. And she'd left me more than money. She'd left me the truth. The kind of truth that destroys empires. The kind that sends people to prison. If you want to know how a family that threw me away ended up begging me for mercy, if you want to see what happens when the forgotten daughter becomes the most powerful woman in the room, then stay with me. Because this story, it's about to get really good. My name is Amber Reynolds. I'm 35 years old, a senior financial analyst at a Fortune 500 company, and for the last 20 years of my life, I've been the family ATM that nobody bothered to say thank you to. I paid for my sister's college tuition when my father claimed he couldn't afford it. I covered my father's medical bills when he had his heart surgery. I sent money home every month like clockwork, even when it meant I ate ramen for dinner and postponed my own dreams. And tonight, driving up to my father's house in the suburbs where I grew up, I had no idea I was about to pay the ultimate price for all that loyalty. The invitation had come 3 days ago. Important family dinner. My stepmother Carol had said over the phone, her voice sugary sweet, in that way that always made my skin crawl. Your father really wants everyone there. It's been too long, Amber. I should have known something was wrong. My father hadn't called me himself in over 2 years. But like the fool I'd always been when it came to them, I said yes. I cleared my schedule, bought an expensive bottle of wine, and told myself that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The moment I walked through that front door, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air in the house felt wrong, cold. My father stood in the hallway, his face blank as a stone wall, and when I moved to hug him, he took a step back like I was contagious. Amber, he said flatly. Not honey, not sweetheart. Just my name delivered like an accusation. Carol appeared from the kitchen wearing a black dress that looked more appropriate for a funeral than a family dinner. Her smile was plastered on tight and unnatural, like someone had told her to look pleasant, but forgot to tell her eyes. "Oh, you made it," she said, taking the wine from my hands without even glancing at the label. "Everyone's waiting in the dining room." Everyone. That word sent ice down my spine. I walked into the dining room and felt like I'd entered a courtroom. The long mahogany table my grandmother had left to my father was set with the good china, the kind we only used for holidays. My sister Madison sat at the far end, scrolling through her phone with an expression of bored contempt. She was 28, beautiful in that effortless way that had always made people forgive her for being utterly useless. She hadn't held a real job in 5 years, bouncing from one creative project to another while living off family money. My money, if we're being honest. And there, sitting in the chair that used to belong to my grandmother, was my mother, my biological mother. The woman who'd divorced my father when I was 12 and who I'd barely heard from since. Seeing her there felt like a betrayal all on its own. "Sit down, Amber," my father said, gesturing to the chair directly across from him, the defendant's seat. I sat. I didn't know what else to do. Dinner started with an eerie silence. Carol brought out course after course prime rib and roasted vegetables and twice-baked potatoes, food that must have cost a fortune. My father's fortune. The money I'd helped him keep when his business almost went under 6 years ago. Nobody said grace. Nobody made small talk. We just ate the sound of silverware against china so loud it felt like nails on a chalkboard. Then my father spoke. "So, Amber," he said, cutting into his meat with surgical precision, "Carol tells me you got another promotion." I nodded, trying to smile. "Yes, senior analyst. It's a big step." He chewed slowly, deliberately. "Lucky timing, I'd say. Lots of companies promoting people these days just to fill quotas." The words hit me like a slap. "Excuse me. Oh, don't be sensitive," Carol chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "He just means it's a competitive field. I'm sure you worked hard. In your own way." Madison snorted into her wine glass. My father turned his attention to her, and his entire face transformed. Warmth flooded into his eyes, the kind of warmth I'd spent my whole childhood begging for and never receiving. "Madison, sweetheart, tell your sister about your new business venture." Madison set down her phone, preening like a peacock. "Oh, it's so exciting, Daddy. I'm launching a lifestyle brand. Wellness, self-care, empowerment. I've got investors lined up and everything." Investors. I almost laughed. Investors who were probably just more family friends she'd charmed into writing checks they'd never see again. "That's wonderful, honey," my mother said softly. My mother. Speaking to Madison like she was her daughter, too. I tried to join the conversation. I mentioned the major account I'd landed last month, the one that had taken 6 months of 18-hour days to close. My father cut me off mid-sentence to ask Madison about her Instagram followers. I brought up the charity work I'd been doing mentoring young women in finance. Carol yawned. Every word I spoke died in that room. Every accomplishment I'd worked myself to the bone for was dismissed with a shrug or an awkward silence or a quick subject change back to Madison's latest vapid achievement. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller in that chair the same way I'd felt my entire childhood. Then my father pushed a folder across the table toward me. "We need you to sign these," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. I opened the folder. Legal documents, dense and official-looking, all related to my grandmother's estate. My grandmother, who'd passed away 3 months ago. My grandmother, who'd been the only person in this family who ever looked at me like I mattered. "What are these?" I asked, scanning the pages. Nothing was clear. Transfers of assets, amendments to trusts, clauses about property distribution. It was deliberately vague, deliberately confusing. "Just formalities," my father said. "Estate stuff. Your grandmother left some loose ends. We need everyone's signature to settle everything properly. I'd like to have my lawyer look at this first." The room went silent. Deadly silent. My father's face turned red. "Your lawyer?" He repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "This is legal documentation involving a significant estate. I'm not signing anything without proper review. That's just common sense." "Common sense." My father's voice rose. "Common sense." He slammed his fist down on the table so hard the plates jumped. Wine glasses tipped. One shattered red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. "You ungrateful, selfish little bitch," he snarled, rising from his chair. "After everything this family has done for you, after all the opportunities we've given you, and you can't do this one simple thing. Dad, I just want to understand what I'm—" "Get out!" he roared. "Get out of my house!" I looked around the table, desperate for someone, anyone, to defend me. To tell him he was being unreasonable. To remind him that I was his daughter. Carol looked down at her plate. Madison smirked, her eyes glittering with satisfaction. And my mother, my own mother, sat there in silence, her face carefully blank. "Get out!" my father screamed again. I stood up slowly. My whole body felt numb. This wasn't anger. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was planned, orchestrated. They'd brought me here for this exact moment. I walked out of that dining room with my head high even though I was dying inside. I walked through the hallway where I'd learned to ride a bike past the stairs I'd climbed 1,000 times as a child. I walked out the front door and didn't look back. But as I reached my car, something made me glance across the street. There was a black sedan parked under the streetlight. The engine was running. And in the driver's seat, illuminated by the glow of a phone screen, someone was watching me. I sat in my car for a long time after that door slammed shut behind me, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The black sedan was still there across the street, engine idling, but I couldn't bring myself to care about mysterious strangers watching me. All I could think about was how predictable this had been. How inevitable. Because the truth was, my father had been throwing me away my entire life. Tonight was just the first time he'd said it out loud. I was 7 years old the first time I learned my place in the family hierarchy. Madison had just been born, this tiny squalling thing that transformed my father into someone I didn't recognize. Someone soft, someone capable of tenderness. I'd been excited to be a big sister. I'd picked out a stuffed rabbit with my own allowance money, wrapped it carefully in newspaper because I didn't know how to use proper wrapping paper yet. When I tried to give it to baby Madison, my father took it from my hands and examined it like I'd offered him garbage. Madison needs real toys, Amber. Quality things, not dollar store junk. He'd thrown my rabbit in the trash right in front of me. I cried myself to sleep that night, and when my grandmother found me the next morning with red, swollen eyes, she held me and whispered, "Some people don't know how to see treasure, baby, but that doesn't mean you're not precious." It became a pattern. Every Christmas, every birthday, I watched my presents get redistributed to Madison because she's younger, she needs it more. Or, you're mature enough to understand, Amber. My bike became her bike. My dollhouse became her dollhouse. Even my bedroom, the bigger one with the window seat I'd loved, got handed to Madison when she turned 5 because she needs more space for all her things. I got moved to the converted attic, and when I cried about it, my father sat me down with that serious expression he reserved for disappointments. "Madison is fragile," he said, as if that explained everything. "She needs extra care, extra attention. You're stronger, Amber. You can handle it." What he really meant was that I wasn't worth the effort. That I was the workhorse and she was the show pony, and everyone knows you don't waste premium hay on something built for labor. When I turned 16 and wanted to try out for the school musical, my father said we couldn't afford the costume fee. 2 months later, Madison enrolled in private violin lessons at $300 a month. When I got accepted to my dream college with a partial scholarship, my father sat me down and explained that the family couldn't help with the remaining tuition. "You'll have to find a way, Amber. Take out loans. Get a job. You're resourceful." I worked 3 jobs that first year. I was a barista at 5 in the morning, a library assistant between classes, and I cleaned houses on weekends. I slept 4 hours a night and my grades suffered, but I survived. And when Madison's high school graduation came around and my father casually mentioned she'd been accepted to an expensive private university, I already knew what was coming. "I hate to ask Amber, but you know the family situation. Your sister deserves the same opportunities you had. Maybe you could help with her tuition, just temporarily, until we get back on our feet." Temporarily lasted 4 years. 48 months of me sending checks while Madison partied her way through college, changing majors 5 times, and graduating with a degree in art history she never used. I never got a thank you card, never got a phone call on my birthday, unless she needed something. The one time I suggested maybe she could get a part-time job to help with expenses, my father called me selfish. Told me I'd gotten hard and cold from all that time in the corporate world, that I'd forgotten what family meant. Then came my father's heart surgery. The insurance didn't cover everything he said. There were complications, experimental treatments. The bills were crushing him. Could I help? Just this once, just until he got back to work, I cleaned out my savings account, delayed buying my first home, watched my colleagues take vacations and go on dates while I picked up overtime shifts to cover his medical expenses. When he recovered and went back to work, I waited for acknowledgement. for recognition that I'd saved his life. Instead, he bought Madison a new car for her birthday. She needed reliable transportation, he explained when I asked about it. You're doing fine on your own, Amber. You don't need our help anymore. My grandmother was the only one who saw it, really saw it. She'd pull me aside at family gatherings, her papery hands holding mine, her eyes fierce behind her bifocals. Live well, honey, she'd whisper. Live well and be patient. Justice will come even if it's late. I'd nod and pretend I believed her, but inside I wondered if justice was just something people told themselves to make injustice bearable. She died 3 months ago, and at her funeral my father cried like he'd lost his greatest supporter. I cried because I'd lost the only person who'd ever looked at me and seen someone worth loving. Now sitting in this car outside the house that had never really been my home, her words came back to me like a whisper on the wind. Live well. Justice will come. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out expecting maybe a cruel follow-up text from Madison, some gloating message about how I'd finally gotten what I deserved. But the number was unknown. The message was 3 words long. They planned this. My blood turned to ice. I stared at those words, reading them over and over, and suddenly the black sedan across the street didn't seem like paranoia anymore. Someone knew something. Someone had been watching. And whatever had just happened in that dining room, whatever game my family had been playing, I was only just beginning to understand the rules. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of sitting alone in my apartment with nothing but silence and betrayal for company felt suffocating, so I just drove. I drove with no destination in mind, the city lights blurring past my windows as that text message burned in my brain like a brand. They planned this. 3 words that transformed everything I thought I understood about tonight. It wasn't my father's rage. It wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was orchestrated, calculated. They'd invited me to that house specifically to humiliate me, specifically to make me leave, and the question that kept circling through my mind like a vulture was why? Why did they need me to sign those papers? Why did my refusal trigger such violent fury? And who the hell was watching me from that black sedan? The highway stretched out before me, empty and dark, and I pressed harder on the gas pedal. Somewhere around midnight, I realized I was heading toward the coast, toward the stretch of shoreline where my grandmother used to take me when I was small. She'd rent a little beach cottage for a week every summer, just the 2 of us, and we'd walk along the water collecting shells and talking about everything and nothing. Those were the only times in my childhood I remember feeling safe, feeling seen. My father never came on those trips. He always had some excuse, some business that couldn't wait, and now I wondered if grandmother had planned it that way. If she'd been carving out space for me away from the toxicity, giving me a pocket of peace before sending me back into the war zone. By the time I reached the coastal road, it was nearly 2 a.m. The ocean stretched out black and infinite to my right, and I found myself pulling over at an overlook I recognized from those long-ago summers. I got out of the car and walked to the edge of the cliff where a rusty guardrail was the only thing between me and a 100-foot drop to the rocks below. The wind whipped my hair across my face, sharp with salt and cold, and I could hear the waves crashing with a violence that matched the chaos in my chest. I'd spent 35 years trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. 35 years pouring myself into a family that saw me as nothing more than an ATM with legs. Every choice I'd ever made had been shaped by their needs, their demands, their constant assertion that I owed them something simply by existing. When had I last made a decision purely for myself? When had I last asked what I wanted instead of what they needed? I couldn't remember. My entire identity had been constructed around serving people who didn't even have the decency to pretend gratitude. And the strangest thing was happening as I stood there on that cliff in the middle of the night, freezing and furious and more alone than I'd ever been. I felt light. For the first time in 20 years, my chest didn't feel compressed by the weight of obligation and guilt. The pain was still there, sharp and real, but underneath it was something I barely recognized. Relief. I was free of them. They'd thrown me out, cut me loose, and in doing so, they'd accidentally given me the one thing I'd never had the courage to take for myself. Permission to walk away. The waves kept crashing, methodical and eternal, and I found myself breathing in rhythm with them, in and out, in and out. This was what freedom felt like, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I thought about all the times I'd imagined cutting them off, going no contact, building a life that didn't revolve around their endless crisis management. But I'd always talked myself out of it. Their family, I'd tell myself. You only get one family. Blood is thicker than water. All those poisonous little platitudes that keep people chained to their abusers because society says you're supposed to love the people who share your DNA no matter how much they damage you. Well, they'd made the choice for me. They'd severed the rope. And standing there with the ocean wind tearing at my clothes and the stars cold and distant overhead, I made myself a promise. I would never go back to being that person. The one who accepted crumbs and called it love. The one who worked herself to exhaustion for people who wouldn't cross the street to help her. I didn't know what came next, didn't have a plan or a strategy, but I knew with absolute certainty that weak, desperate Amber was dead. She'd died the moment my father screamed those words. Whatever rose from her ashes would be something different, something harder. That's when the pieces started falling into place. The mysterious text, the strange car, the way my father had pushed those documents across the table with such urgency, the way everyone had been positioned around that dining room like actors in a play, each one playing their assigned role. This wasn't about me being ungrateful or difficult. This was about those papers. Whatever was in my grandmother's estate, whatever assets or properties or trusts she'd left behind, my family wanted control of it. Needed control of it. And my signature on those documents was the key to something important enough to justify this elaborate theater of cruelty. My grandmother had died 3 months ago, and in that time I'd been kept deliberately distant from any estate proceedings. My father claimed he was handling everything, that I didn't need to worry about complicated legal matters, that he'd let me know if I needed to be involved. I'd been so buried in grief and work that I'd accepted his assurances without question. But grandmother had been a wealthy woman. She'd owned property, had investments, and she'd always been shrewd about money in a way my father never was. What if there was something in her will he didn't want me to know about? What if tonight had been about getting my signature before I could learn the truth? The ocean roared below me, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain this time. Purpose. Someone out there knew what was happening. Someone had sent me that text, had been watching to see what would happen. Maybe they were an ally. Maybe they were another player in whatever game my family was running. Either way, I needed answers, and I needed them fast before my father could execute whatever plan tonight had set in motion. My phone rang, the sound so sudden and sharp in the night silence that I actually jumped. I pulled it from my pocket with shaking hands, expecting another anonymous message. But the caller ID read a name I recognized. Patterson and Associates. My grandmother's law firm. At 2:30 in the morning, my dead grandmother's lawyer was calling me. I stared at the screen as it rang once, twice, and suddenly I understood that everything was about to change. Whatever came next, whatever truth was waiting on the other end of this call, there would be no going back to the life I'd known. The old Amber would have let it go to voicemail, too afraid of conflict or confrontation. But the woman standing on this cliff, baptized by wind and rage and newfound freedom, wasn't afraid anymore. I answered the phone. "Miss Reynolds, I apologize for calling at this hour." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to a woman who sounded like she was in her 60s. "This is Margaret Chen from Patterson and Associates. I'm the executor of your grandmother Eleanor Reynolds' estate. I've been trying to reach you all evening, but your father informed me you were unavailable. However, given certain developments, I felt it was imperative we speak immediately, regardless of the time. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe." "What developments?" There was a pause, the kind that comes before life-changing information. "Miss Reynolds, Are you somewhere private? Somewhere safe? I'm alone, I said, looking out at the empty darkness surrounding me. What's going on? I need to inform you of something your family has been actively working to prevent you from learning. Margaret's voice took on an edge of anger. 3 months ago, when your grandmother passed, her will was read to the immediate family. Your father was present, as was your stepmother. You were not invited to that reading, which was highly irregular given the contents of the will. Miss Reynolds, your grandmother, named you as the sole beneficiary of her entire estate. The words didn't make sense at first. They bounced off my brain like stones off water. Sole beneficiary. But my father said he was handling everything. He said the estate was complicated and your father lied. Margaret's words were sharp and clear. Your grandmother's estate is valued at approximately $42 million. This includes a coastal property in Mendocino, currently worth $20 million, various investment portfolios, stocks, bonds, and liquid assets. All of it was left to you, Amber. Every single penny. My legs gave out. I sank down onto the cold ground, my back against the guardrail. The phone pressed so hard to my ear it hurt. That's not possible. Why would she? I mean, my father, Madison, their family too. Your grandmother was very specific in her wishes. I could hear papers rustling on Margaret's end. But here's where it gets interesting and why I'm calling you in the middle of the night. 3 years ago, your grandmother transferred ownership of the Mendocino property to you as an irrevocable gift. It's been in your name since then, completely paid off, all taxes current. She did this specifically to remove it from the probate process. The property cannot be contested because legally it's been yours for 3 years. You just didn't know it. I couldn't process what I was hearing. A $20 million house had been mine for 3 years, and nobody told me. Why wouldn't she tell me? Because she knew what your family would do. Margaret's voice softened. Miss Reynolds, your grandmother left you a sealed letter with specific instructions that it only be opened and read to you personally after her death, and only after your family had been informed of the will's contents. She predicted their reaction with remarkable accuracy. Would you like me to read it to you now? Yes. The word came out as barely a whisper. I heard the sound of an envelope being opened, paper unfolding. Then Margaret began to read, and it was my grandmother's voice. I heard her cadence, her warmth coming through this stranger's professional tone. My dearest Amber, if you're hearing this letter, it means I'm gone. And it means your father has done exactly what I knew he would do. He's thrown you out, turned the family against you, made you feel small and worthless and alone. Don't be afraid, sweetheart. I knew this would happen. That's why I protected you years ago when I was still healthy enough to plan properly. Everything I have, I'm leaving to you. Not because I don't love the others, but because you're the only one who never asked me for anything. You're the only one who visited me because you wanted to, not because you needed something. You're the only one who saw me as a person instead of a bank account. The house in Mendocino, the one we spent those summers in when you were little, that's been yours for 3 years now. I wanted you to have a safe place somewhere they couldn't touch. The rest of the money is tied up in legal trusts that your father can't access no matter how hard he tries. And darling, he will try. He's been trying to get his hands on my assets for 30 years. There's a secret that's been sleeping that long, a truth about this family that I've kept buried to protect the people I love. But you need to know that your father's cruelty isn't random. It's strategic. You represent something he fears, though you don't know it yet. Be strong, my girl. Live well. Justice has finally come, even if I'm not there to see it. Tears were streaming down my face, hot and fast, and I couldn't stop them. She'd known. She'd known everything. While I'd been working myself to death, trying to earn love from people who would never give it, my grandmother had been building me a fortress. She'd seen the future, seen exactly how this would play out, and she'd made sure I'd survive it. Miss Reynolds, Margaret's voice was gentle. Are you all right? The letter mentioned a secret, I managed to say through my tears. What secret? I don't know, Margaret admitted. Your grandmother didn't share everything with me. but I can tell you that over the past 3 months your father and his attorney have filed multiple motions to contest the will. Every single one has been denied. Your grandmother's legal protections were absolutely ironclad. She worked with 3 different law firms to make sure there were no vulnerabilities. The trust is unbreakable. The property transfer is legitimate, and there's nothing your family can do to access any of it. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, something hard and bright crystallizing in my chest. That's why they wanted me to sign those papers tonight. They were trying to trick me into signing away my rights before I knew what I had. Almost certainly, Margaret agreed. And when you refused, when you said you wanted your own lawyer to review them, your father must have panicked. Better to throw you out dramatically and paint you as the villain than to let you discover the truth on your own terms. The black sedan, the mysterious text. Someone had been watching to see if their plan would work. Someone wanted me to know I'd been set up. But who? Miss Reynolds. There's one more thing. Margaret's voice dropped, taking on a grave quality that made my stomach clench. This evening, approximately 2 hours ago, your father filed a new lawsuit. Not against the estate this time. Against you, personally. He's claiming you manipulated your grandmother in her final years, that you used undue influence to coerce her into changing her will. He's accusing you of elder abuse and fraud. It's completely baseless, but it's also very public and very ugly. By tomorrow morning, this will be all over the local news. They're trying to destroy your reputation before you even know you have something worth fighting for. The ocean roared below me, and I realized I was smiling. Actually, smiling. Because they'd just made their biggest mistake. They'd declared war on someone who finally had nothing left to lose. When can I see the property? I asked. Margaret met me at the property the next morning with a folder full of documents and a set of keys that felt heavy as stones in my palm. The drive up the coastal highway had taken 2 hours, winding through forests of redwood and cypress, until the road opened up to reveal the ocean sprawling endless and gray beneath an overcast sky. Then I saw it. The mansion sat on a cliff overlooking the water, a sprawling Mediterranean-style estate with white stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and more windows than I could count from the road. It was the kind of house you saw in magazines, the kind that didn't seem real, and for a moment I couldn't believe my grandmother had owned it. Couldn't believe it was mine. She bought it 30 years ago, Margaret said as we pulled through the iron gates. Paid cash. She'd come here alone several times a year, sometimes for weeks at a time. Your father never visited, as far as I know. She told me once that this was her sanctuary, the only place she could think clearly. We parked in the circular driveway, and I got out slowly, staring up at the house that had apparently been mine for 3 years without my knowledge. It was beautiful, breathtaking, and something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The interior was even more overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the ocean like living paintings. The furniture was elegant but comfortable, clearly expensive but not ostentatious. Everything was meticulously maintained, dust-free and perfect, as if grandmother had just stepped out for a walk and would be back any moment. Margaret explained that a property management company had been handling maintenance paid for through the trust, and that they'd kept everything exactly as grandmother left it per her instructions. I walked from room to room in a daze, running my fingers along surfaces that belonged to me, trying to wrap my mind around the fact that this palace was now my home. But underneath the wonder was something else, an odd sensation that prickled between my shoulder blades as I moved through the halls. The house was too quiet, too still, and I kept feeling like I was being watched, even though Margaret and I were the only people there. Some of the rooms felt warm and welcoming, filled with afternoon light and the smell of the ocean. Others felt colder, heavier, like they were holding their breath. The library in particular made me uneasy. It was a massive room, lined floor to ceiling with books, a fireplace at one end, and leather chairs positioned for reading, but the energy in there felt dense somehow, expectant. Over the next few days, I threw myself into establishing my new life. Margaret helped me hire a security company to install cameras and alarms, state-of-the-art systems that would alert me to any breach of the property. I interviewed housekeepers and settled on a kind woman in her 50s named Rosa, who'd worked for wealthy families up and down the coast and came with impeccable references. I hired a gardener, a handyman, and most importantly, a personal security guard named Marcus, who was a former Marine with the kind of quiet competence that made me feel safe for the first time in days. I bought new clothes, set up my home office, and transferred my work files so I could operate remotely. My boss had been surprisingly understanding when I'd explained I needed to relocate immediately due to a family emergency. The irony of calling it a family emergency wasn't lost on me. But despite surrounding myself with people during the day, the nights were lonely in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not the crushing loneliness of being unloved that I'd felt my whole life. This was different. This was the loneliness of transformation, of shedding an old skin and not yet being comfortable in the new one. I'd lie awake in the massive master bedroom with its view of the moonlit ocean and feel like I was floating in space, untethered from everything I'd known. The old Amber had been ground down to nothing, and the new Amber was still taking shape. I was becoming someone harder, someone who wouldn't be used again. But the metamorphosis hurt in ways I hadn't expected. It was during one of those sleepless nights around 3 a.m, at the end of my first week in the house, that I decided to explore properly. I'd been sticking mostly to the main living areas, too overwhelmed to investigate every corner of the sprawling estate. But insomnia and curiosity drove me out of bed and down the stairs with just my phone's flashlight to guide me. I found myself drawn back to the library, that room that had made me so uneasy. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a room. But as I stood in the doorway, something made me look more carefully at the walls. There were marks. Small symbols carved or painted into the wood trim so subtle you'd miss them unless you were looking closely. I moved closer, running my fingers over an odd circular design with lines radiating from the center like a compass rose. It was no bigger than a quarter, hidden in the corner where 2 walls met. I turned slowly, scanning the room, and found another one on the opposite wall. Then another by the window. A trail. My grandmother had left me a trail. I followed the symbols with my heart pounding, moving along the walls until I reached the far bookcase. The last symbol was carved into the wooden frame at shoulder height, and unlike the others, this one looked newer, fresher. I pressed on it experimentally and heard a soft click. The bookcase swung inward like a door, revealing a darkness beyond. My hands were shaking as I shone my phone light into the hidden space. It was a small room, maybe 10 feet square, with bare walls and a single item sitting in the center. An old floor safe, the kind you'd see in a bank from the 1940s, with a combination lock and more of those strange symbols etched into the metal surface. There was a layer of dust on top, but the safe itself looked solid and secure, like it had been waiting here for decades. I stood there staring at it, my mind racing. What had grandmother hidden here? What secrets had she been keeping that required this level of concealment? And why leave me these breadcrumbs unless she'd wanted me to find them? I pulled out my phone to call Margaret to ask if she knew anything about this, when the security system's alert tone chimed through the house. Someone was at the front gate. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and my blood turned to ice. Standing in the glare of the gate lights, looking haggard and desperate, was my father. He was pressing the intercom button repeatedly, his face twisted with an emotion I couldn't read from the grainy video. Even from here, even through the screen, I could feel the rage rolling off him in waves. He'd found me. Less than a week after throwing me out of his house, he'd tracked me down to the mansion he'd spent months trying to steal. And now he was at my door at 3 a.m, demanding to be let in. I watched him slam his fist against the gate, watched his mouth form words I couldn't hear, and I realized that whatever came next, whatever confrontation was about to happen, I was no longer the frightened daughter desperate for scraps of approval. I was standing in a $20 million house that was legally mine, with a hidden safe full of my grandmother's secrets, and my father was the one on the outside looking in. The tables had turned so completely it almost made me laugh. Almost. because the expression on his face told me he wasn't here to apologize. He was here for war. I didn't go to the gate. Instead, I pulled up the intercom system on my phone and activated the two-way audio, watching my father's face fill the security camera screen. Marcus had already been alerted by the alarm and was on his way from the guest house, but I held up my hand when he appeared in the hallway. I wanted to handle this myself. I needed to see if the new Amber, the one who owned this fortress and had nothing left to lose, was strong enough to face down the man who'd spent 35 years breaking her into pieces. "Dad," I said into the intercom, my voice steady and cold. "It's 3 a.m. What do you want?" His face crumpled at the sound of my voice, and I watched in real time as he deployed the tactics that had worked on me my entire childhood. His shoulders sagged, tears welled in his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was choked with emotion that might have been convincing if I hadn't seen him use this exact performance 100 times before. "Amber, baby, please. I'm so sorry. I need to talk to you. I need to explain what happened that night. It was all a terrible misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. As if screaming at me to get out of his house in front of the entire family had been some kind of miscommunication. As if the orchestrated humiliation, the legal documents, the coordinated silence of every person at that table had been accidental. I watched him wipe at his eyes and felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt. Just a cold, clear awareness that this was theater and I was no longer a captive audience. "There's nothing to explain," I said. "You made yourself very clear." "No, honey, you don't understand." He moved closer to the camera, his face distorting slightly in the fisheye lens. "I was under so much stress that night. Your stepmother had been pressuring me about the estate, and Madison was upset, and I just snapped. I didn't mean those things I said. You're my daughter, my firstborn. I love you." The words came out smooth and practiced, and I wondered how many times he'd rehearsed this speech on the drive up the coast. How many times he'd played the role of the repentant father in his head, certain it would work, because it always had before. "If you love me so much," I said, "why did you file a lawsuit against me claiming I abused my grandmother?" His mask flickered. Just for a second, I saw something ugly flash across his face before the grief-stricken father expression slammed back into place. "That wasn't my idea. My lawyer said it was the only way to protect the family assets. Your grandmother wasn't in her right mind those last few years, Amber. You have to know that. She was confused, easily manipulated. Someone got to her, convinced her to cut out her own son, and it's not right. It's not fair to the family." There it was, the real reason for the tears and the middle-of-the-night visit. He wanted me to give up the money, wanted me to sign over my inheritance because a lifetime of conditioning told him I would cave under pressure, that I was still the people-pleasing daughter who'd rather set herself on fire than disappoint him. I felt Marcus shift beside me, ready to intervene, but I shook my head slightly. I wanted to see how far my father would go. "Grandmother was perfectly competent," I said. "She had 3 law firms verify her mental fitness. The will is ironclad. But you already know that, don't you? Your lawyers told you there's no legal way to break it." His jaw tightened. "Then do the right thing, Amber. Transfer the assets to the family trust. Put everything in a place where we can all benefit from it together. Your grandmother would have wanted the whole family taken care of, not just you. This is selfishness, plain and simple. This is you being vindictive because you didn't get enough attention as a child." The audacity of it took my breath away. He was standing outside my gate at 3 a.m. after throwing me out of his house and filing a lawsuit calling me a criminal, and somehow I was the selfish one. I was the problem. The laugh that came out of me was sharp and bitter. Vindictive, I worked 3 jobs to pay Madison's tuition. I emptied my savings to cover your medical bills. I gave you 20 years of my life, and all I ever asked for was basic respect. And you couldn't even give me that. "You have no idea what you're talking about." His voice was rising now, the careful control starting to slip. "You think your grandmother was some kind of saint? You think she gave you all that money because she loved you best? You're naive, Amber. There are things you don't know. Things she did. Things she was trying to hide." "What things?" I demanded, leaning closer to the phone. What did grandmother do that terrifies you so much? She destroyed this family. The words exploded out of him, raw and vicious. She's been manipulating all of us for 30 years, pulling strings, setting us against each other, and now she's doing it from beyond the grave. You don't understand the bigger picture. You never did. You were always too busy playing the martyr to see what was really happening. I watched him on the screen, watched the way his hands were shaking, the way his eyes kept darting around like he expected someone to appear from the shadows. This wasn't just anger. This was fear. Real, bone-deep fear of something I didn't understand yet. Something grandmother had known about and protected me from. Something locked in that safe in the hidden room. Then explain it to me, I said quietly. Tell me what I'm missing. For a moment, I thought he might actually do it. His mouth opened, his face twisted with indecision, and I could see him weighing the cost of honesty against the cost of continued secrecy. Then something hardened in his expression. Something cold and final. Give me the estate, Amber. Sign it over to the family trust by the end of the week, or I swear to God I will destroy you. I will make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I have evidence. I have proof of things you've done. Things that will end your career, your reputation, everything. What are you talking about? I was genuinely confused now. What evidence? What did I supposedly do? You know exactly what you did. His voice dropped to something venomous and cold. And if you don't cooperate, the whole world will know too. Marcus stepped forward, then his presence filling the space beside me. Sir, you need to leave the property now. Miss Reynolds has asked you to go. But my father wasn't done. He looked directly into the camera, directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not love, not even hate, just pure, calculating menace. We know what you did, Amber, and we're not afraid to use it. Marcus was already moving toward the gate, his hand on the radio calling for backup from the security company. My father must have seen him coming because he backed away from the intercom, still shouting something I couldn't make out. Then he turned and ran back to his car, tires squealing as he took off down the long driveway into the night. I stood there in the silence he left behind, my heart hammering against my ribs, and realized that whatever game we were playing had just escalated to a level I didn't understand. My father had threatened me with evidence of something I'd supposedly done, but I hadn't done anything. Which meant either he was bluffing, trying to scare me into submission, or someone had fabricated evidence to use against me. Either way, the people who'd once controlled me through love-bombing and guilt were now willing to destroy me completely. And the most terrifying part was that I had no idea what they thought I'd done wrong. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the library with every light blazing, staring at the hidden doorway behind the bookcase and replaying my father's words over and over. We know what you did. The threat had been so specific, so confident, that part of me wondered if I'd somehow blocked out some terrible mistake. But no matter how hard I searched my memory, I came up empty. I'd lived my entire adult life trying to be perfect, trying to be beyond reproach, specifically because I was terrified of giving my family ammunition to use against me. Whatever evidence my father claimed to have, it was either a bluff or a fabrication. Which meant I needed someone who could separate truth from lies, who could dig into the shadows where my family had been operating for decades. By 7 a.m, I was on the phone with Margaret asking for recommendations. By 9, I was sitting across from a woman named Claire Hendricks in a coffee shop in the nearest town. Claire was in her late 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd seen everything humanity had to offer and wasn't impressed by any of it. She'd spent 20 years as a detective with the San Francisco Police Department before going private, and Margaret had described her as ruthlessly thorough and completely discreet. I needed both. Your father threatened you with mystery evidence, Claire said after I'd explained the situation, her pen moving across a notepad in quick, efficient strokes. That's either desperation or confidence. We need to figure out which. I'll need access to financial records, property documents, anything related to your grandmother's estate. I'll also need permission to look into your father's business dealings and personal accounts. Whatever you need, I said. I want to know everything, how long they've been planning this, what they think they have on me, and what the hell my grandmother was protecting me from. Claire's investigation took 3 days, and when she called me back to her office, the folder she placed on the desk between us was thick enough to qualify as a weapon. Your father, she said without preamble, has been systematically draining your grandmother's accounts for the better part of 30 years. It started small. A few thousand here and there loans that were never properly documented business expenses that got charged to her credit cards, but it escalated over time. She pulled out bank statements highlighted in yellow marker showing transfers from accounts in my grandmother's name to accounts belonging to my father, tens of thousands at a time, sometimes more. How did grandmother not notice? I asked, my stomach turning as I scanned the numbers. She did notice, Claire said grimly. About 15 years ago, she tried to cut him off. Changed her passwords, moved money into protected accounts, even threatened legal action. That's when things got ugly. She slid another document across the desk, this one a court filing from 2009. My father had attempted to have my grandmother declared mentally incompetent, claiming she was suffering from dementia and needed a conservator, him. If it had worked, he would have had complete control over her finances. But it didn't work, I said, reading through the filing. The case was dismissed. Not just dismissed, withdrawn. Claire tapped the document with one finger. Your father's lawyer pulled the petition 24 hours after filing it. No explanation given. But I did some digging and the timing is interesting. Your grandmother's attorney delivered a sealed envelope to your father's lawyer that same day. Whatever was in that envelope made your father back down completely. He never tried the conservatorship route again. I thought about the safe in the hidden room, the one covered in symbols that matched the trail my grandmother had left me. She had evidence, something that scared him enough to leave her alone. That would be my guess, Claire agreed. And based on the pattern of financial activity, I'd say she held that evidence over his head for the rest of her life. He kept stealing from her, but more carefully. Smaller amounts, less obvious patterns. And she let him as long as he stayed away from you. Away from me? I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Claire pulled out another set of documents, these ones showing account activity in my name. Your father opened several credit cards using your identity between 2008 and 2010. Ran up significant debt and never paid it off. Your credit score tanked. That's probably why you had such a hard time getting approved for your first apartment, your first car loan. You thought you were just starting from zero, but actually, you were starting from the negative because your father had been using your name to secure financing he had no intention of repaying. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. All those years I'd struggled thinking I was just unlucky or financially incompetent, and it had been him all along, sabotaging me from the shadows. Grandmother knew about this too. She found out in 2010 and hired a forensic accountant, got everything documented, got the debts discharged through fraud claims, and got your credit repaired. It took her 2 years and cost her about $50,000 in legal fees. She never told you because she didn't want you to know how badly your father had betrayed you. Claire's expression softened slightly. Your grandmother spent a lot of money protecting you from the truth, Amber. She knew it would destroy you. I pressed my hands flat against the desk to stop them from shaking. What about Madison? You said you found her name on loans? That's where it gets complicated. Claire flipped to a different section of the folder. Madison's name is on multiple loans totaling over $200,000. Personal loans, business loans, even a mortgage on a property she doesn't live in. The signatures are hers, verified by handwriting analysis. But here's the thing, Madison was 16 when the first loan was originated. Legally, those contracts shouldn't even be valid. Someone with authority over her had to co-sign or give permission. My father, I breathed. Almost certainly. And given Madison's age and financial dependency, a good lawyer could argue she was coerced or manipulated into signing documents she didn't understand, Which means Madison isn't your enemy here, Amber. She's another victim. Your father has been using both his daughters as financial pawns for decades. The image I'd built of Madison, the spoiled princess who got everything while I got nothing, began to crack and reshape into something more complicated. More tragic. Maybe the reason Madison had never had to work wasn't because she was lazy. Maybe it was because our father had already enslaved her in ways I couldn't see. "There's one more thing," Claire said, and her tone made me look up sharply. "I traced the mysterious evidence that made your father withdraw his conservatorship case in 2009. Your grandmother's attorney has since passed away, but his firm kept meticulous records. The envelope your grandmother had delivered contained documentation of financial fraud, identity theft, and what appears to be evidence of a much older crime, something from 30 years ago that your grandmother discovered and kept secret. The notes don't specify what the crime was, but they reference police reports, witness statements, and photographs." "Where's that evidence now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Claire met my eyes. "That evidence, Amber, is in the safe in your house. Your grandmother's instructions were explicit. If anything happened to her, if your father tried to contest the will or harm you in any way, that safe was to be opened and the contents made public." She set up a dead man's switch. "And your father knows it exists. That's why he's so desperate to get control of the property. That's why he showed up at your gate in the middle of the night. He's not just trying to steal your inheritance. He's trying to bury evidence that could destroy him completely." I thought about my father's face on the security camera, the genuine terror I'd seen beneath the anger. "We know what you did," he'd said, but he'd gotten it backward. The question wasn't what I'd done. The question was what he'd done 30 years ago that was bad enough to make my grandmother keep evidence locked in a safe for 3 decades. Bad enough to use as a weapon against her own son. Bad enough that he'd spend the rest of his life stealing and lying and destroying his daughter's futures just to keep it hidden. I stood up the folder of evidence clutched in my hands. "I need to open that safe." Before I could drive back to the mansion to open the safe, Claire stopped me with one more piece of information that changed everything I thought I understood about my sister. She pulled out a slim folder marked with Madison's name and slid it across the desk with an expression that looked almost like pity. "You should see this before you make any decisions about your family," she said quietly. "These are copies of documents Madison signed between the ages of 16 and 25. I think you need to understand what your sister's been living with." I opened the folder and felt my worldview tilt sideways. The first document was a loan application dated when Madison was barely 16. Her signature shaky and childish next to my father's bold scrawl. $50,000 borrowed against a property she didn't own with her listed as the primary borrower. The next document was similar, then another. By the time Madison turned 18, her name was attached to nearly $250,000 in debt she couldn't possibly have understood or consented to in any meaningful way. And there, on every single document, was my father's signature as co-signer and guarantor, the person with actual legal authority. "He was building a paper trail," Claire explained. "If anyone ever investigated his financial dealings, Madison would be the one holding the bag. He could claim she was the irresponsible one, the one who took out all these loans and mismanaged the money. She was his insurance policy." I thought about all the times I'd resented Madison for being the favorite for getting everything handed to her while I worked myself to exhaustion. I'd seen her expensive clothes, her new cars, her carefree lifestyle, and assumed she was spoiled and selfish. But what if every gift had come with strings attached? What if every dollar had been another link in a chain my father was using to bind her? "There's more," Claire said, and showed me bank statements revealing that Madison had never actually controlled the money attached to these loans. The funds went into accounts she had access to, but my father was listed as a joint holder with full withdrawal privileges. He'd take out loans in her name and then spend the money himself, leaving her legally responsible for debt she'd never benefited from. It was systematic financial abuse dressed up as parental generosity. I drove back to the mansion in a daze, my mind replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Madison through this new lens. The smirk at the dinner table that I'd interpreted as contempt, had that been the defense mechanism of someone who'd learned to hide fear behind arrogance? The way she'd avoided talking to me for years, had that been shame rather than superiority? I remembered a moment 5 years ago that I'd dismissed at the time, but now felt pregnant with meaning. Madison had called me out of nowhere one afternoon, unusual because we rarely spoke outside forced family gatherings. We'd been making awkward small talk when she'd suddenly said, "Amber, you need to be careful around Dad. He's not what you think." And then she'd stopped mid-sentence. I'd heard a door slam in the background, heard her breathing change, and she'd laughed that brittle laugh she used when she was performing. "Never mind," she'd said quickly. "I'm being dramatic. Everything's fine." She'd hung up before I could ask what she meant. At the time, I'd written it off as Madison being Madison attention-seeking and melodramatic. But what if she'd been trying to warn me? What if she'd been attempting to break through the role our father had cast her in to reach out to the sister she'd been taught to compete with, and something, or someone, had stopped her? The door slam. The sudden shift in tone. Someone had been listening. Someone had reminded her of the consequences of talking. I thought about the way Madison had looked at me during that final dinner, the one where our father had screamed for me to leave. I'd interpreted her smile as satisfaction, as proof that she'd always hated me. But now I wondered if it had been resignation. Relief, maybe, that for once I was the one being thrown to the wolves instead of her. Or perhaps something darker, envy that I was finally being released from the cage she was still locked inside. The more I understood about Madison's situation, the more my anger curdled into something more complex. She'd been given the appearance of privilege while being trapped in a different kind of prison. I'd been the obvious scapegoat, the one who was openly neglected and exploited, but Madison had been the hidden victim, the one whose chains were disguised as jewelry. Our father had used us both, just in different ways. He'd made me believe I had to earn love through sacrifice, and he'd made Madison believe she was powerless to refuse his demands. We'd both been groomed to serve his needs, and he'd been clever enough to pit us against each other, so we'd never compare notes and realize what he was doing. I was still processing this revelation when I pulled up to the mansion and saw Marcus waiting for me at the door with an expression of concern. "Miss Reynolds, your sister called the house phone about an hour ago. She sounded distressed. Said she needed to reach you urgently, but your cell was going to voicemail." I pulled out my phone and realized I'd forgotten to take it off silent mode after my meeting with Claire. There were 6 missed calls from an unknown number and 1 voicemail. I played the message right there in the driveway, and Madison's voice came through the speaker, shaking so badly I almost didn't recognize it. She wasn't the polished, confident woman who'd smirked at me across the dinner table. This was someone terrified, someone whose carefully constructed armor had finally cracked apart. "Amber," she whispered, and I could hear her crying. "Amber, I know you probably hate me. I know I've been awful to you. But you need to know the truth about what Dad did, about what he's been doing to both of us. I should have told you years ago, but I was too scared, and now it's too late because he knows that I know, and he's—" Her voice broke completely. There was a sound in the background like something falling, and Madison's breathing turned rapid and panicked. "He's going to do something terrible. I can't stop him. You have to protect yourself. The safe, Amber. Grandmother told me about the safe before she died. She said if anything ever happened to her, if Dad ever tried to hurt you, you had to open it. She said the truth about our family is in there. The truth about him. About all of us." There was a longer pause filled with the sound of Madison trying to get her breathing under control. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I'm so sorry for everything. I should have been your sister instead of his accomplice. But I was trapped and I was weak, and I let him turn us against each other because it was easier than fighting him. Grandmother knew. She always knew. That's why she left everything to you. You're the strong one, Amber. You always were. Please just open the safe and you'll understand. You'll understand everything." The voicemail ended and I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, my heart hammering against my ribs. Madison knew about the safe. Grandmother had told her. Which meant Grandmother had been trying to protect both of us in different ways. She'd given me the money and the property as armor. And she'd given Madison information as a weapon, trusting that eventually we'd find our way to each other and piece together the truth. I tried calling Madison back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times with the same result. The fear in her voice, the way she'd said, "I don't have much time," echoed in my head like a warning siren. My father knew that Madison knew, and if he was desperate enough to threaten me, desperate enough to file false lawsuits and show up at my gate in the middle of the night, what would he do to the daughter he'd been using as a financial shield for over a decade? What would he do to silence her? I spent the rest of that day trying to reach Madison, calling every number I had for her, even reaching out to her few social media accounts with increasingly desperate messages. Nothing. By evening, I'd contacted the police to file a missing persons report, but they'd been frustratingly dismissive. Madison was an adult, they said. She hadn't been missing long enough to warrant immediate action. Had I tried calling her friends, her workplace? I'd wanted to scream that Madison didn't have real friends, that our father had isolated her just as thoroughly as he'd exploited her, but I'd swallowed my frustration and thanked them for their time. Marcus had offered to drive to my father's house to check on Madison, but I'd refused. Sending my security guard to confront my father felt like an escalation I wasn't ready for, not when I didn't fully understand what we were dealing with yet. Instead, I'd focused on the safe. I'd spent hours in that hidden room, trying combinations, trying to decode the symbols etched into the metal, but nothing worked. The safe was old enough that forcing it open would likely destroy whatever was inside, and I couldn't risk that, not when it might contain the only leverage I had against my father. By midnight, exhausted and no closer to answers, I'd finally gone to bed. Though sleep felt impossible with Madison's terrified voice echoing in my head. The alarm shrieked through the house at 2 a.m, jolting me awake with my heart already racing. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and pulled up the security camera feeds, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the device. The motion sensors had been triggered at the back of the house near the kitchen entrance. I switched to that camera and felt my blood turn to ice. There was someone there. A figure in dark clothing hunched near the door doing something I couldn't quite make out. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but the silhouette was clearly feminine slender with long hair that could have been Madison's. Marcus was already responding, his voice coming through the intercom system. "Miss Reynolds, stay in your room and lock the door. I'm handling this." I could see him on another camera feed moving through the house with professional efficiency, but I couldn't just hide. Not if that was Madison out there. Not if she'd come here desperate and afraid and needed help. I pulled on a robe and grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping by my bed, then slipped out of my room and down the back stairs following Marcus's path, but staying far enough behind that I wouldn't interfere with whatever he was doing. By the time I reached the kitchen, Marcus had already gone outside and I could hear his voice through the door, authoritative and firm. "This is private property. Identify yourself and state your business." There was no response that I could hear, just the sound of footsteps running, then silence. I opened the door cautiously and found Marcus standing in the pool of light from the back porch, his flashlight scanning the darkness beyond. "Whoever it was ran when they saw me coming," he said without turning around. "Headed toward the tree line. Want me to pursue?" "No," I said quickly, my mind still trying to process what I'd seen on the camera. "Let's just secure the house and call the police." But as Marcus turned back toward the door, his flashlight swept across the ground and caught something that made us both stop. Footprints. Clear impressions in the damp soil of the flower bed beneath the kitchen window, leading from the driveway to the back door, and then away toward the trees. Women's shoes, small, the kind of expensive sneakers Madison always wore. Marcus called in the incident while I examined the area more closely, and that's when I found the paper. It was caught in the bushes near the window, torn and crumpled like someone had dropped it while running. I picked it up carefully using the edge of my robe so I wouldn't disturb any fingerprints and smoothed it out under the porch light. The handwriting was shaky and rushed, written in what looked like eyeliner or some other makeup because the letters were smudged and dark. Check the library. Third shelf from top. Red leather journal. Truth about Dad. I'm sorry. M. My first instinct was relief. Madison had come here to help me, to give me information, not to hurt me. But then Marcus crouched down next to the footprints with his own flashlight, examining them with the careful attention of someone who'd been trained to notice details. "Miss Reynolds," he said slowly, "these prints are wrong." He pointed to the impressions with one gloved finger. "See how shallow they are, and the spacing. This person was either significantly lighter than the shoe size suggests, or someone was trying to make it look like they were running when they were actually walking carefully. These aren't natural footprints." I stared at the evidence, my mind racing. "You think someone faked this? Made it look like Madison was here?" "I think someone wanted us to find these prints and that note," Marcus said grimly. "I think someone's trying to make you believe your sister broke into your house. The question is why." I thought about the voicemail, about Madison's terror, about my father's desperate threats. Someone was playing a game here, trying to manipulate me into distrusting Madison, trying to drive a wedge between the two people who might actually be able to stand against him together. But who my father was the obvious suspect, but he didn't seem sophisticated enough to pull off this kind of psychological operation. My stepmother, Carol, I'd always written her off as weak and complicit, but maybe I'd underestimated her. Or was there someone else involved? Someone I hadn't even considered yet. Marcus called in the police, and while we waited for them to arrive, I went to the library and found the red leather journal on the third shelf, exactly where the note had indicated. My hands trembled as I opened it, but the pages inside were blank. Every single one. It was a prop placed there specifically for me to find another piece of theater in whatever elaborate production someone was staging. The break-in wasn't real. The footprints were fake. The note was manufactured. Even the journal was part of the script. Someone had orchestrated all of this to make me paranoid, to make me question whether Madison was friend or foe, to keep me confused and reactive instead of thinking clearly. The police arrived around 3:30, took statements, examined the evidence, and promised to increase patrols in the area. They were professional and thorough, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Rich woman in a mansion claiming someone tried to break in, but didn't actually break anything or take anything. They probably thought I was paranoid or attention-seeking. They dusted for fingerprints that wouldn't be there, photographed footprints that had been deliberately planted, and treated the whole thing like a minor incident rather than part of a larger pattern of harassment and intimidation. By the time they left, it was nearly 5 in the morning, and I was running on pure adrenaline and coffee. Marcus had gone to do a final perimeter check, and I was sitting in the library staring at that blank journal and trying to figure out my next move when I heard vehicles pulling up outside. Multiple vehicles. I pulled up the camera feeds and felt my stomach drop. 2 police cars unmarked and 4 officers in plainclothes walking toward my front door with expressions that looked nothing like the sympathetic concern of the officers who'd just left. The doorbell rang sharp and official, and when I opened it, one of the officers held up a badge. "Miss Amber Reynolds." Her voice was flat, professional, the tone of someone delivering bad news they'd delivered 100 times before. "I'm Detective Sarah Morrison with the Financial Crimes Division. We need you to come with us immediately. There are some serious allegations that require your immediate attention." My mouth went dry. "What allegations?" "We'll discuss that at the station," Detective Morrison said, her expression giving nothing away. "You have the right to contact an attorney. In fact, I'd strongly suggest you do so. This is regarding accusations of fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Your father filed a formal complaint this evening with substantial evidence. We need your statement." I stood there in my doorway at 5 in the morning, having just been through a staged break-in designed to frame my sister, and now I was being told my father had successfully turned his threats into legal action. He'd weaponized the very crimes he'd committed against me, twisted them around until somehow I was the criminal, and he was the victim. And the worst part was I had no idea what evidence he'd fabricated or how deep his lies went. I only knew that whatever game we'd been playing had just become deadly serious. I called Margaret from the back of the police car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She answered on the second ring despite the ungodly hour, and when I explained what was happening, her response was immediate and fierce. "Don't say a word until I get there. Not one word, Amber. Do you understand? They'll try to make you comfortable, try to make you think cooperating will help your case. It won't. Stay silent." I promised I would. And then I sat in that car watching the mansion disappear behind me and tried not to think about how thoroughly my father had outmaneuvered me. While I'd been investigating him, gathering evidence of his crimes, he'd been busy framing me for the very things he'd done. The police station was exactly what you'd expect at 5:30 in the morning. Fluorescent lights, too bright, coffee burnt and bitter, the smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask decades of human desperation. Detective Morrison led me to an interrogation room that was small and windowless, with a metal table bolted to the floor and chairs that had seen better years. She offered me water, which I refused, and then she sat across from me with a folder thick with papers and an expression that suggested she'd already decided I was guilty. "Miss Reynolds, we've received a complaint from your father, Robert Reynolds, alleging that you established a shell company in Delaware for the purpose of money laundering and tax evasion." She opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "This is the incorporation paperwork for Reynolds Consulting LLC filed in March 2020. Your name is listed as the registered agent and sole member. The company received over $300,000 in wire transfers over the course of 2 years, none of which were reported on your tax returns." I looked at the document and felt that same surreal displacement I'd felt watching my father scream at me to leave his house. This was my signature on the forms, or at least something that looked convincingly like it. The address listed was an apartment I'd lived in 5 years ago. Even my social security number was there, printed in neat boxes. "I didn't create this company," I said quietly, remembering Margaret's instruction to stay silent, but unable to stop myself from stating the obvious. "I've never heard of Reynolds Consulting LLC. Someone forged my signature and used my information without my knowledge." "That's a serious accusation," Detective Morrison said, her tone suggesting she'd heard this defense before and didn't find it compelling. "Do you have any proof that someone else had access to your personal information?" "I want my lawyer." I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt. "I'm not answering any more questions until she arrives." Margaret showed up 45 minutes later, looking like she'd dressed in about 3 minutes, but with a briefcase that suggested she was ready for war. She spoke to Detective Morrison privately for several minutes, and when they came back into the room, the detective's expression had shifted from certain conviction to cautious skepticism. Margaret sat beside me and placed a folder of her own on the table. "My client is happy to cooperate fully with this investigation," she said crisply, "because she has nothing to hide. However, I think you'll find that the evidence doesn't support the allegations Mr. Reynolds has made. In fact, I believe the evidence will demonstrate that Mr. Reynolds himself is the one who committed these crimes." She opened her folder and pulled out the documents Claire had compiled, the ones showing my father's decades-long pattern of financial fraud. "Robert Reynolds has a documented history of identity theft involving his daughter. In 2008, he opened multiple credit cards in Amber's name without her knowledge or consent, ran up significant debt, and destroyed her credit rating. It took 2 years and considerable legal expense to resolve. We have the fraud reports the credit bureau disputes and the police reports filed at that time." Detective Morrison's expression shifted slightly, interest replacing skepticism. Margaret continued pulling out more documents. "Furthermore, we have evidence that Mr. Reynolds has been systematically embezzling from his own mother's estate for 30 years. Unauthorized withdrawals, forged checks, fraudulent loan applications. When his mother discovered this and attempted to cut off his access approximately 15 years ago, he retaliated by trying to have her declared incompetent so he could control her finances as conservator. That case was withdrawn after Mrs. Eleanor Reynolds provided evidence of his criminal activity." "This is all very interesting," Detective Morrison said slowly, "but it doesn't prove Miss Reynolds didn't establish this company." "Actually, it does." Margaret pulled out one final document with the precision of someone playing a winning card. This is medical documentation from UCLA Medical Center showing that Amber was admitted on March 14, 2020, for severe exhaustion and dehydration. She remained hospitalized for 6 days. The Delaware Company Incorporation was filed on March 15, 2020. Amber was unconscious in a hospital bed in California when these documents were allegedly signed in Delaware. Unless she developed the ability to be in 2 places at once, someone else filed these papers using her stolen identity. I watched Detective Morrison's face as she examined the hospital records, saw the moment when doubt hardened into something closer to belief. She looked up at Margaret, then at me, and I could see her mentally recalculating the entire situation. "Why didn't your father mention you were in the hospital during this time period?" "Because he's the one who put the company in my name," Margaret said bluntly. "He has motive, means, and opportunity. He's done it before. And he's currently engaged in a bitter legal battle over an inheritance he believes should have been his. This complaint isn't about justice, detective. It's about revenge." The interrogation shifted after that. Detective Morrison started asking different questions. Questions about my father's finances instead of mine. Questions about his access to my personal documents. Questions about his business dealings. I answered carefully, sticking to facts I could prove, and watched the detective's skepticism transfer from me to my father. By the time Margaret and I walked out of that police station 3 hours later, I wasn't under arrest, but I knew this wasn't over. My father had played his hand too early, gotten sloppy in his desperation, but he still had cards left to play. The sun was fully up by the time Marcus picked us up from the station, and I felt hollowed out, exhausted, in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Margaret promised to follow up with the police to make sure they understood the full scope of my father's fraud, but we both knew legal battles moved slowly, and my father was clearly willing to burn everything down before he'd let me have what grandmother had left me. We were almost back to the mansion when Marcus suddenly pulled over to the side of the road. "Miss Reynolds, there's something on your windshield." He got out and retrieved what looked like a standard business envelope tucked under the wiper blade. No postage, no return address, just my name written in block letters. Marcus examined it carefully before handing it to me through the window. "Want me to open it first?" I shook my head and tore it open myself. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message printed in the same anonymous block letters. "Don't trust anyone in that house, including your mother." I stared at those words, my mind reeling. My mother, who I'd barely spoken to in years. My mother who'd sat silent at that dinner table while my father threw me out. My mother who, according to Claire's investigation, had signed papers 20 years ago giving my father access to grandmother's funds. I'd written her off as weak as a bystander in my father's schemes, but what if she'd been more than that? What if she'd been a willing participant all along? The anonymous messenger, whoever they were, seemed to think my mother was dangerous. But why? What did she have to gain from any of this? And more importantly, why was someone going to such elaborate lengths to warn me about her specifically? I looked down at the message again, at the careful, deliberate printing, and realized that someone out there was watching everything. Someone knew about the mansion, about my mother, about the secrets buried in my family's past. Someone was trying to help me, feeding me information piece by piece, but anonymous help was just another form of manipulation, and I'd had enough of being someone's puppet. Whatever game was being played, whatever truth was locked in that safe, I needed to uncover it myself before someone else's agenda got me killed. When I got back to the mansion, I went straight to my office and locked the door, ignoring Marcus's concerned questions and Rose's offers of food. I sat at my desk with that anonymous envelope and tried to understand what I was missing. The message said, "Don't trust my mother," but the envelope itself felt wrong. Too convenient. Too perfectly timed. Someone had placed it on my windshield while I was being interrogated, which meant they'd followed me to the police station or had been watching the mansion and knew when I'd left. The level of surveillance required to pull that off suggested resources and planning that went beyond my father's capabilities. I turned the envelope over in my hands and noticed something I'd missed in my exhaustion. There was a slight bulge in the corner, something more than just the paper. I tore it open more carefully this time, and found what I'd overlooked before: a small flash drive, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. My hands were shaking as I plugged it into my computer, half expecting malware or some kind of trap. But what loaded instead was a folder of scanned documents. Old documents, judging by the yellowed paper and faded ink. The first file was dated June 2004, when I was 14 years old. It was a power of attorney form granting my father access to certain accounts held in my grandmother's name. The signature at the bottom, witnessed and notarized, belonged to my mother. The next document was similar, dated a few months later, this time authorizing my father to make medical decisions for grandmother if she became incapacitated. Then another and another, a cascade of legal paperwork spanning from 2004 to 2008, each one signed by my mother, each one granting my father more and more control over grandmother's life and assets. By the time I reached the last document, I felt physically sick. My mother hadn't just stood by while my father exploited grandmother. She'd been his accomplice, his enabler, the one who'd given him legal cover to do whatever he wanted. I don't remember making the decision to confront her. I just found myself in my car driving the 2 hours back toward the city where my mother still lived, in the same small apartment she'd moved into after the divorce. I'd visited maybe 3 times in the last decade, our relationship reduced to awkward phone calls on birthdays and holidays where we'd both pretend we were closer than we actually were. Now, as I pulled up outside her building in the early afternoon, I realized I didn't even know who this woman was. The mother I'd invented in my head, the victim of my father's cruelty, who'd been too weak to protect me, was a fiction. The real woman was someone who'd actively participated in my destruction. She answered the door in sweatpants and an old cardigan, her hair grayer than I remembered, her face lined with exhaustion that seemed to have settled into her bones. "Amber," she said, surprise and something that might have been fear flashing across her expression. "I didn't know you were coming. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, pushing past her into the apartment. "Everything is not all right. We need to talk about what you did." I watched the blood drain from her face as I pulled out my laptop and showed her the documents. She didn't try to deny it, didn't offer excuses or explanations. She just sank down onto her couch and started crying deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. "I'm so sorry," she gasped between tears. "God, Amber, I'm so sorry. I was so weak. I was so scared." "Scared of what?" I demanded, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "Scared enough to help him steal from your own mother. Scared enough to sign away her rights and mine. Scared of losing you." The words came out like a scream, raw and desperate. "Your father said if I didn't sign those papers, if I didn't cooperate, he'd take you away from me completely. He said he'd prove I was an unfit mother, that I was mentally unstable, that I'd lose custody, and I'd never see you again. And I believed him, Amber. He'd already destroyed me in the divorce. He had money and lawyers and connections. I had nothing. I was living in this apartment, working 2 jobs just to make rent. What was I supposed to do? I wanted to feel sympathy for her. Wanted to understand that she'd been trapped and terrified and doing what she thought was necessary to survive. But all I could feel was a rage so pure it made my vision blur. "You were supposed to protect me," I said. "You were supposed to tell someone. Go to the police. Tell grandmother. Do literally anything except help him." "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to tell your grandmother once, about 5 years after the divorce. I called her and said we needed to talk, that there were things she needed to know about your father. But before I could meet with her, he found out. He showed up at my apartment in the middle of the night and he..." She broke off, wrapping her arms around herself. "He didn't hit me. He was too smart for that. But he described in very specific detail what would happen if I ever tried to undermine him again. What would happen to you? What would happen to Madison? And I believed every word." I sat down across from her, my anger warring with a horror I didn't want to acknowledge. "So you just kept signing papers, kept helping him rob grandmother blind, for 14 years. I thought if I cooperated, if I gave him what he wanted, he'd leave you alone," she said, tears still streaming down her face. "I thought I was protecting you by playing along. I didn't realize he was using Madison too until it was too late. And by then your grandmother had figured out what was happening and she was protecting you in her own way. She never told me her plans, but I knew she was doing something. Setting up trusts, moving money around, meeting with lawyers. She was building a fortress around you that your father couldn't penetrate." "Did you know about the will?" I asked. "Did you know she left everything to me?" My mother nodded miserably. "Your father told me. 3 months ago, right after she died. He was furious. Said you'd manipulated her, turned her against the family. He was planning something, I could tell, but he wouldn't tell me what. Just said he needed to get you out of the way before you learned the truth about the inheritance." "That's why you came to the dinner," I said, understanding flooding through me. "You were part of the setup. You were there to make it look legitimate, to make me think the whole family had turned against me." "I didn't know what he was planning," she protested weakly. "He just said it was important that I be there, that we needed to present a united front. I thought maybe he wanted to reconcile, to actually repair things. I should have known better." I stood up, unable to sit still anymore, pacing her small living room like a caged animal. "There's more going on here than just Dad being greedy and you being weak. Someone's been helping him, someone with money and connections and the ability to orchestrate all of this. The fake company in my name, the staged break-in, the timing of everything. Dad's not smart enough to pull this off alone." My mother's face went very still, very pale. "There is someone," she said quietly. "There's been someone behind your father for years. Since before the divorce, maybe longer. I don't know his name. Your father would never tell me. But I'd hear him on the phone sometimes late at night talking to someone he was clearly afraid of. Someone he owed money to. Someone who had power over him." "Who?" I demanded. "Who is this person?" "I don't know," she repeated, and I believed her. "But your grandmother knew. That's why she kept all that evidence locked away. That's why she was so careful about protecting you, because it wasn't just your father you needed protection from. It was whoever was controlling him." She stood up slowly, walked to a bookshelf and pulled out an old shoebox from the back. Inside was a jumble of papers, photographs, and at the bottom a single brass key on a thin chain. She held it out to me with shaking hands. "Your grandmother gave me this about 6 months before she died. She said if anything ever happened to her, if your father ever came after you the way she knew he would, I should give you this key. She said everything started in her secret room. That all the answers you'd need were locked in there waiting for you to be strong enough to find them." I took the key, feeling its weight settle into my palm like a promise or a curse. It was old, the brass tarnished with age, the kind of key that might open an antique safe or a hidden door. "Why didn't you give this to me sooner? Why wait until now?" "Because I'm a coward," my mother said simply. "Because I was afraid of what would happen when you opened whatever this key unlocks. Your grandmother told me the truth, and that safe would destroy our family completely, that once you knew there'd be no going back. And I thought maybe if I just waited, if I just stayed quiet somehow, everything would work itself out without more pain. But I was wrong. I've always been wrong. And now my daughter won't even look at me without hate in her eyes, and I deserve every bit of it." I closed my fist around the key and walked toward the door. "I don't hate you," I said without turning around. "I just don't know who you are anymore. Maybe I never did." I left her there in that apartment full of old mistakes and broken promises, and I drove back to the mansion with that key burning a hole in my pocket. The safe was waiting. Grandmother's truth was waiting. And whatever I found inside was going to change everything just like she'd promised. I was finally ready to know. The key felt like it was burning through my pocket during the entire drive back to the mansion, a physical reminder of all the secrets waiting to be uncovered. By the time I pulled through the gates, evening was falling, painting the ocean in shades of amber and gold that would have been beautiful if I'd been capable of noticing anything beyond the pounding of my own heart. Marcus met me at the door with questions I waved away, telling him I needed to be alone, that I had work to do that couldn't wait. He nodded understanding in the way that good security personnel do, that sometimes privacy is its own form of protection. I went straight to the library, that room that had made me uneasy from the first day, and stood in front of the bookcase that concealed the hidden door. The symbols I discovered that first sleepless night were still there, subtle marks carved into the wood that formed a trail only visible if you knew to look for them. I pressed the one that had opened the passage before, heard that soft click, and watched the bookcase swing inward to reveal the small, hidden room beyond. The safe sat exactly where I'd left it, old and imposing, covered in those same mysterious symbols that seemed to be my grandmother's private language. The key slid into the lock with a smoothness that suggested it had been used recently despite being decades old. My hands were trembling as I turned. It heard the internal mechanisms release with a sound like a sigh and pulled open the heavy door. The interior was packed with papers, folders, leather-bound journals, everything organized with the meticulous care my grandmother had brought to every aspect of her life. I pulled out the first stack and carried it to the library floor, spreading documents around me in a circle like I was performing some kind of ritual. Which in a way, I suppose I was. This was the exhumation of family secrets, the autopsy of lies that had shaped my entire existence. The oldest documents dated back to 1989, the year I was born. Private investigator reports the kind with black and white surveillance photos clipped to typed pages. My father entering buildings at odd hours. My father meeting with men whose faces had been circled and annotated with names and criminal records. My grandmother had suspected something was wrong with her son-in-law from the very beginning, and she'd done what any smart woman with resources would do. She'd hired professionals to watch him. The reports painted a picture of a man living far beyond his means, borrowing money from dangerous people, using his marriage to my mother and his connection to grandmother's wealth as collateral for loans he had no intention of repaying. One report from 1992 made me stop breathing. It detailed my father's attempt to take out a life insurance policy on my mother without her knowledge, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. The investigator had flagged it as suspicious, noting that my father had significant gambling debts and had recently been denied a loan by every legitimate bank in the state. My grandmother had intervened, the investigator noted, threatening to expose my father's financial crimes unless he canceled the policy immediately. She'd been protecting my mother, protecting me even when we didn't know we needed protection. But it was the journals that truly devastated me. My grandmother's handwriting, small and precise, filling page after page with observations and fears and strategic plans. She'd known my father was dangerous decades before anyone else had seen it. She'd documented every manipulation, every lie, every time he'd used me or my mother, or later Madison, as leverage to get what he wanted. And she'd planned accordingly, moving money into untouchable trusts, creating legal barriers, building the fortress that would eventually become my inheritance. But what struck me most was the love that saturated every word. This wasn't the work of someone protecting assets. This was a grandmother desperately trying to save her granddaughters from a monster she'd accidentally welcomed into the family. There was an entry from my 16th birthday that made tears stream down my face. Amber worked 3 jobs today. 3 jobs. She's 16 years old, and she's already been conditioned to believe her value lies in what she can provide rather than who she is. Robert has done this to her systematically and deliberately, and I can't stop it without destroying what's left of this family. So instead, I build walls. I create safe spaces she doesn't know exist yet. I make sure that when he finally reveals his true nature completely, she'll have somewhere to land that he can't touch. I love her so much it physically hurts. I hope someday she'll understand that every choice I made was about keeping her safe until she was strong enough to fight back. I sat there on the library floor, surrounded by evidence of my grandmother's love, and felt something break open in my chest. She'd seen me, really seen me, not as a resource or a burden or a disappointment, but as a person worth protecting at any cost. And she'd known that someday I'd be sitting exactly where I was, now reading these words, finally understanding that I'd never been alone even when I felt most abandoned. But there was one envelope at the very bottom of the safe that I'd been avoiding, the one marked with my name in my grandmother's handwriting and sealed with red wax, like something out of another century. I opened it carefully, unfolded the thick paper inside, and began to read words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. My dearest Amber, if you're reading this, you've found the safe and you've begun to understand the depths of your father's corruption. But there's one truth I've kept hidden longer than all the others, one secret that explains why he's so desperate to control this family's narrative. 30 years ago, I made a choice that changed all our lives. I fell in love with the wrong man, a brilliant, ambitious businessman named Douglas Hale, who promised me the world and then abandoned me the moment I became inconvenient. I was pregnant, Amber. Pregnant and alone and terrified. Your father had just married your mother, and when I told him about my situation, he saw an opportunity. He agreed to raise my child as his own, to tell everyone she was his daughter in exchange for unlimited access to my financial resources. It was blackmail dressed up as family loyalty, and I was desperate enough to agree. That child, the one whose destiny was stolen by my mistakes and your father's greed, the one who's been used as a pawn in his schemes since the day she was born, deserves to know the truth. She deserves to understand why she was treated differently, why your father held her on a leash made of debt and fear. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter. I already knew what the next sentence would say before I read it, but seeing the words written in my grandmother's careful script made them undeniably, irrevocably real. That child is Madison. Your sister is actually your aunt. And her biological father, Douglas Hale, has recently returned to claim what he believes belongs to him. I read the letter 3 times before my brain would accept what it was telling me. Madison wasn't my sister. She was my aunt. The age difference between us suddenly made a different kind of sense, as did so many other things that had never quite added up. I remembered being 7 years old when Madison was born, remembered my mother being strangely distant during the pregnancy, remembered my father's excessive joy at having another daughter that had seemed performative even to my child's eyes. Because it had been a performance. The whole thing had been theater, a carefully constructed lie that my father had used to extract money and power from my grandmother for 3 decades. I dug deeper into the safe and found what I was looking for: Madison's original birth certificate, the real one, not the amended version that had been filed after my father legally adopted her. Mother Eleanor Margaret Reynolds, Father Douglas Hale. Date of birth, April 15, 1993. There were other documents too, letters between my grandmother and various lawyers discussing the adoption, how to make it appear legitimate, how to protect Madison's true identity from becoming public record. My grandmother had been terrified the letters revealed. Terrified of the scandal, terrified of losing her standing in the community, but most of all terrified of being a single mother at her age with no support system. Douglas had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the child, had actually threatened legal action if my grandmother ever tried to claim he was the father. So she'd turned to my father, who'd seen the situation for exactly what it was: leverage. The documents showed he'd negotiated the terms of Madison's adoption like a business deal. He'd take the baby, raise her as his own, keep the secret, and in exchange, he'd have unlimited access to grandmother's wealth. It was extortion with a smile wrapped in the language of family obligation. And grandmother, desperate and ashamed and running out of options, had agreed. What devastated me most was finding grandmother's journal entries from the years after Madison's birth. She'd tried to be a grandmother to both of us, but the guilt of what she'd done to Madison ate at her constantly. I see her growing up in Robert's house, and I know she's not happy, one entry read. She's too quiet, too eager to please, always watching Robert's face to see if she's doing the right thing. He's made her afraid of him the way he tried to make Amber afraid. But with Maddie, it's worse. With Maddie, he has ultimate power. He knows I can't intervene too directly without raising questions about why I care so much about this particular grandchild. He's using my own shame as a weapon against her. Another entry from Madison's 16th birthday, right around the time my father had started putting loans in her name. Robert came to me today and told me Maddie needs to start contributing to the family finances. 16 years old, and he wants her to sign loan documents. When I objected, he reminded me that he could tell Maddie the truth at any time, that he could destroy her world with a few sentences. That maybe it's time the whole family knew what kind of woman I really am. So I transferred another $50,000 to his account and hated myself for being so weak. Maddie deserves better than this. They both deserve better. I sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of my family's lies, and felt my understanding of Madison completely transform. Every cruel word she'd ever said to me, every smirk, every moment of apparent callousness, suddenly looked different through this new lens. She hadn't been the favored daughter living a charmed life. She'd been a hostage raised by a man who wasn't really her father, but who held her entire identity in his hands like a loaded gun. The favoritism I'd resented wasn't love, it was control. My father had lavished attention on Madison, not because he cared about her, but because she was his golden ticket, the secret that kept my grandmother's checkbook open. And Madison had never known. That was the cruelest part. She'd grown up believing she was Robert Reynolds's biological daughter, believing she had some special claim to his affection that I lacked. She'd built her identity around being the chosen one, never understanding that she'd actually been the most exploited one. At least I'd known I wasn't valued. At least I'd understood from an early age that I needed to be self-sufficient, because my family wouldn't catch me if I fell. But Madison had been trapped in a web of lies so complex, she couldn't even see the threads. The letter from grandmother continued explaining that Douglas Hale had recently resurfaced. He'd discovered somehow that Madison was his daughter, and he wanted to leverage that relationship to get access to the estate he believed should have been partially his. Douglas is dangerous, grandmother wrote. More dangerous than Robert because he's smarter and more patient. Robert is driven by greed and ego. Douglas is driven by vengeance. He's never forgiven me for refusing to acknowledge him as Madison's father, for denying him access to the wealth he thought he could claim through her. Now that he knows about my assets, about the trust fund I've established for Madison, he wants control. He's been working with Robert for at least 2 years now, I'm certain of it. They're planning something. That's why I'm writing this all down, making sure you know the truth before they can use Madison against you. Because that's what they'll do, Amber. They'll make you think Madison is your enemy so you won't join forces with her. Don't let them. She's not your competition. She's your ally if you can make her see it. I was still processing this, still trying to reconcile the Madison I'd resented for 30 years with the Madison who was actually my grandmother's abandoned daughter when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Madison's number, and I answered it without thinking my voice hoarse from crying. Madison. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Amber. Her voice was terrified, barely intelligible. Amber. You have to come. Please. He's here. Douglas is here, and Dad let him in, and they're talking about you, about grandmother, about the will, and I tried to listen, but Dad caught me, and he's so angry, Amber. He said if I don't cooperate, if I don't help them, he'll tell everyone what I really am. He's going to destroy me. He's going to destroy both of us. Where are you? I was already moving, grabbing my keys, shouting for Marcus. Dad's house. The basement. He locked me in the basement, and they're upstairs planning something, and I can hear them through the vent, and Amber, they're talking about making you disappear. Douglas said it's the only way. That if you're not around to claim the inheritance, if something happens to you, then Madison becomes the heir and they can control her because they've always controlled her, and I don't know what to do, I don't know how to stop them. The line went dead. I stared at my phone trying to call back, but it went straight to voicemail. Madison was trapped in my father's house with 2 men who were actively plotting my murder, and she was terrified enough to reach out to me despite years of conditioning that had taught her I was the enemy. This was it. This was the moment my father and Douglas had been building toward. And if I didn't get to Madison in time, if I didn't somehow stop what they were planning, neither of us would survive long enough to learn any more family secrets. Marcus was in the car with me before I'd even finished explaining his expression grim as he pulled up a tracking app on his phone that could locate Madison's device. "If she's in danger, we're calling the police," he said firmly, his professional demeanor slipping into something more protective. "I'm not letting you walk into a hostage situation without backup." I nodded, too focused on the blinking dot on the screen to argue. Madison's phone was moving, which meant either she'd escaped or someone had taken it from her. The signal was heading west away from my father's house toward the more isolated stretch of coastline where property was sparse and houses sat empty for most of the year. We followed the signal for 20 minutes, Marcus driving faster than was probably legal, while I tried Madison's number over and over with no response. The sun had fully set by the time we pulled off the main road onto a rutted dirt path that led through scrub brush and twisted cypress trees. The GPS showed Madison's phone was close now, maybe half a mile ahead, and my stomach was twisted in knots, imagining what we might find. Marcus parked the car where the path became too narrow to drive and pulled a flashlight from the glove box along with something else that made my breath catch. "A gun." "I have a license to carry," he said quietly, reading my expression. "And if your father and this Douglas person are planning what your sister said they're planning, I'm not going in there unarmed." I couldn't argue with that logic, even though the sight of the weapon made everything feel more real, more dangerous. We walked the rest of the way on foot, following the signal, until we saw it an old beach house, the kind that had probably been beautiful in the 1960s, but was now weathered and sagging windows dark, and one side of the porch collapsed into the sand. Madison's phone signal was coming from inside. Marcus made me wait behind a dune while he approached first, checking the perimeter with the professional caution of someone who'd done this kind of thing before. When he signaled that it was clear, I ran to the house and pushed through the front door, which hung crooked on its hinges. "Madison." My voice echoed through the empty space, and then I heard it. A whimper from somewhere deeper in the house. I found her in what had once been a bedroom, curled in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees, her face streaked with tears and dirt. There were bruises on her arms, dark purple marks that looked like fingerprints, and when she saw me, she made a sound that was half sob, half relief. "Amber?" She tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and I caught her feeling how badly she was shaking. "He hit me. Dad actually hit me. I've never seen him like that. He was so angry when he realized I'd heard them talking when he figured out I was going to warn you." Her words tumbled out in a rush, barely coherent. "They're going to kill you, Amber. Douglas said it was the only way to get control of the estate. That if you had an accident, if something happened that looked natural, then I'd inherit as the next heir, and they could manipulate me into signing everything over. Dad agreed. He actually agreed to have you murdered." I held her while she cried, this woman who I'd resented my entire life, and felt the last of my anger toward her dissolve into something like kinship. We were both victims of the same monster, just wounded in different ways. "How did you get away?" I asked when her breathing had steadied slightly. "I waited until they were both drunk," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "They were celebrating, talking about how the plan was finally coming together. Douglas kept saying how he'd waited 30 years for this, how grandmother had humiliated him, and now he was going to take everything she'd built. I grabbed my phone and Dad's laptop, and I ran. I knew about this place because we used to come here when I was little before it was condemned. I thought I could hide here until I figured out what to do." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small laptop and a USB drive. "I copied everything from Dad's computer. All his files, all his emails with Douglas. Everything they're planning is on here. Bank accounts, money laundering schemes, the fake evidence they manufactured against you. All of it." Marcus took the USB and laptop, his expression darkening, as he skimmed through some of the files. "This is enough to put both of them away for decades," he said. "Financial fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. But Miss Reynolds, you need to understand that releasing this information will destroy your family's reputation completely. Everyone will know about the embezzlement, about Madison's parentage, about everything your grandmother tried to keep private." Madison looked at me with red, swollen eyes. "I don't care anymore," she said. "I'm so tired of protecting him. Tired of being his hostage. If exposing him means exposing me too, then so be it. I just want it to be over." But I could see the fear behind her bravado, the terror of having her entire identity revealed as a lie. She'd lived 28 years believing she was Robert Reynolds' daughter, believing she belonged to a family that had never really wanted her. Learning the truth about Douglas Hale, about grandmother, about all of it would be devastating even without the public humiliation. "We'll figure it out," I said, squeezing her hand. "We'll find a way to get justice without destroying you in the process. I promise." I meant it too. For the first time in my life, I felt protective of Madison rather than resentful. She was my aunt, technically, but titles didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we were both survivors of the same abuse and we were finally on the same side. That's when we heard it. Footsteps outside crunching through the sandy soil. More than one person moving with purpose toward the house. Marcus immediately moved in front of us, his hand going to his weapon, and my heart dropped into my stomach. They'd found us. Somehow, despite Madison's precautions, despite the isolated location, my father and Douglas had tracked us down. I looked at Madison and saw my own terror reflected in her face. The USB in Marcus's pocket contained everything we needed to destroy them, but we were trapped in an abandoned house with no way out and no backup coming. The footsteps were getting closer, and I realized with a clarity that felt almost like calm that this was the moment everything would either end or begin. We'd either walk out of this house with the power to take down two dangerous men, or we'd never walk out at all. The front door creaked open and a shadow fell across the threshold. The man who stepped through the doorway wasn't my father. He was taller, better dressed with silver hair, styled in a way that suggested expensive barbers and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He wore a cashmere coat, despite the mild coastal evening, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, even though he'd just walked through sand and dirt. Everything about him screamed money and power, but it was his eyes that made my blood run cold. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and completely devoid of warmth. This was a man who'd learned to smile without meaning it to charm, without feeling it to destroy, without regretting it. "Amber Reynolds," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, the kind of voice you'd hear narrating a nature documentary about predators. "And Madison. How convenient to find you both here. It saves me the trouble of tracking you down separately." He stepped fully into the room, and I noticed two men following behind him, both built like linebackers, both wearing the kind of blank expressions that suggested they were hired for muscle rather than conversation. Marcus's hand tightened on his weapon, but Douglas noticed and held up one manicured hand in a gesture that was almost lazy. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. My associates are armed and considerably less patient than I am. We're just here to talk. A civilized conversation between adults." "You're Douglas Hale," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. Behind me, I felt Madison shrink back, her hand clutching mine so tightly it hurt. "I am," he confirmed, inclining his head slightly, as if accepting a compliment. "I'm impressed you figured that out so quickly. Your grandmother clearly raised you to be resourceful. It's a shame she wasted so much effort trying to keep me away from my own daughter." His gaze slid to Madison, and something that might have been regret flickered across his face before vanishing back into that cold composure. "Hello, Madison. I suppose this isn't quite how I imagined our first meeting, but life rarely follows the script we write for it." "You're not my father," Madison said, her voice stronger than I expected. "Robert Reynolds is my father. You're just some man my grandmother had an affair with 30 years ago." "Biologically, I'm very much your father," Douglas corrected gently as if he were explaining something to a child. "And that matters more than you might think. But we can discuss the complexities of parentage later. Right now, I'm more interested in what you're holding." He nodded toward Marcus, toward the pocket where the USB drive rested. "That belongs to me. Well, technically it belongs to your father, but since I've been financing his lifestyle and his schemes for the better part of a decade, I think we can agree that makes it mine by proxy. You've been using him? I said, pieces clicking together in my head. All those years of financial crimes, the identity theft, the embezzlement, you were behind it. You were the one pushing him to steal from grandmother to exploit his own daughters, all so you could get access to her money. Douglas's smile widened slightly, and I realized he was enjoying this. Enjoying the reveal, the moment where we understood just how thoroughly we'd been played. Your father is a weak, greedy man with delusions of competence. He was laughably easy to manipulate. I simply convinced him that he deserved more than your grandmother was willing to give, that he was the victim of her favoritism, and then I provided him with the means to take what he wanted. Loans at favorable rates, legal connections, advice on how to exploit the system. All I asked in return was a percentage and occasional access to information about Eleanor's assets. Why? Madison asked, her voice breaking on the word. If you didn't want me, if you walked away when grandmother was pregnant, why come back now? Why do all this? Something ugly flickered across Douglas's perfect features. Because your grandmother humiliated me. When I was young and ambitious, I thought marrying into old money was the fastest path to building an empire. Eleanor was beautiful, connected, wealthy, and I thought I could control her. But she was smarter than I gave her credit for. When she got pregnant, she refused to trap me with a marriage, refused to let me use our child as leverage. She actually laughed when I threatened to go public unless she paid me off. Said no one would believe me, that she had lawyers who would bury me in litigation until I was too poor to afford food. So I walked away, built my own fortune through less legitimate means. And for 30 years I've watched from a distance while Eleanor lived her comfortable life, while she turned my daughter into a pawn in her sick family games. And I waited for the perfect moment to take everything from her, the way she took my dignity from me. But she died before you could do it, I said, understanding flooding through me. The will surprised you. You thought you'd have time to manipulate her, to worm your way back into the family through Madison, but she died and left everything to me instead. Precisely. Douglas's voice hardened, losing that veneer of civility. Your grandmother's final act of spite, leaving her entire estate to a granddaughter she barely saw instead of to Madison, her own daughter. She did it to spite me, to make sure I could never benefit from Madison's inheritance. It was petty and cruel, and exactly the kind of thing Eleanor would do. So you partnered with our father to steal it? Madison said. You helped him frame Amber, helped him manipulate me, all so you could get money you were never entitled to in the first place. Entitled? Douglas's laugh was sharp and cold. I'm Madison's biological father. By any moral standard, I'm entitled to provide for my child, to have input into her life and her inheritance. But legalities matter more than morality in this world, so yes, I adapted my approach. Your father has been quite useful in that regard. Desperate men are always the most cooperative. He took a step closer, and Marcus shifted his stance, ready to intervene. Now I'll give you a choice. You can hand over that USB drive and the laptop along with signed documents transferring half of Eleanor's estate to Madison with me as her financial guardian, or I can take what I want by force. My associates are more than capable of that. You're threatening to kill us over money, I said, disbelief warring with terror. You'd murder your own daughter for inheritance. I've done worse for less, Douglas said simply, and the casual way he said it made my skin crawl. I've destroyed businesses, ruined families, eliminated obstacles. This is just business, Amber, nothing personal. You happen to be standing between me and something I want. Move aside, give me what's mine, and we can all walk away from this alive. Refuse, and well. He gestured to his associates. Let's just say accidents happen in abandoned buildings all the time. A tragic collapse, 3 bodies recovered weeks later, no one to blame. He was serious. Completely, utterly serious. This wasn't a bluff or a scare tactic. Douglas Hale had spent 30 years nursing a grudge against my grandmother, and he was fully prepared to murder both her granddaughters to satisfy it. I looked at Madison, saw my own terror reflected in her face, and realized we were facing something far more dangerous than my father's greed. My father was predictable, sloppy, emotional. Douglas was cold calculation, a predator who'd spent decades perfecting his craft. "We need time to think about this," I said, trying to buy us anything, any delay that might give us a chance. "You have until tomorrow evening," Douglas said, checking his watch like we were discussing a business meeting rather than extortion and murder. "I'll be in touch with location details. Come alone, bring the evidence, and we'll negotiate a settlement that benefits everyone, or don't and face the consequences." He turned to leave his associates falling into step behind him, and then paused at the door. "Oh, and ladies, don't bother going to the police. Your father has already laid extensive groundwork painting both of you as unstable and vindictive. Any accusations you make will sound like desperate lies from daughters trying to steal their poor father's money. I've done this before. I know exactly how to make people disappear legally before I make them disappear permanently." He walked out into the night, leaving us shaking and terrified in that abandoned house. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We'll meet again, Amber. Make the right choice." I looked at Marcus at Madison at the USB drive that contained evidence that could destroy Douglas, but might not be enough to save us. Because he was right. He'd been playing this game for 30 years, and we'd only just learned the rules. The real enemy had never been my father. He'd just been a tool, a weapon wielded by someone infinitely more dangerous. And now that weapon was pointed directly at both of us, with a finger on the trigger. We didn't go home that night. Marcus drove us to a hotel 2 towns over, paid cash for the rooms, and stationed himself in the hallway between our doors like a sentinel. I barely slept, and from the sounds coming through the wall, neither did Madison. By dawn, I'd made a decision. If Douglas Hale wanted war, he'd get one, but it would be fought on my terms with weapons he didn't expect. I wasn't going to be cornered into signing away my grandmother's legacy out of fear. I was going to dismantle him piece by piece using the very system he thought he'd mastered. My first call was to Margaret, who answered with the groggy irritation of someone woken too early until I explained what had happened. Then she was all business, her voice sharp and focused. "You need a team," she said. "Not just me. You need a media strategist, a crisis management expert, and investigators who can verify everything on that USB before we take it public. Give me 2 hours." She had them assembled in 90 minutes, a conference room in her firm's office filled with people whose reputations preceded them. The lead attorney was a woman named Patricia Kern, who'd taken down 3 senators and a Fortune 500 CEO. The PR specialist was Jason Chen, who'd managed reputation recovery for victims of corporate fraud. Together, they represented the kind of firepower that cost more per hour than most people made in a month. I didn't care. Grandmother's estate could afford it, and more importantly, this was exactly what she'd wanted that money used for. We spent the entire day analyzing the contents of the USB drive and my father's laptop. What we found was even more damning than I'd hoped. Years of email correspondence between Douglas and my father detailing every scheme they'd run together. Bank records showing my father transferring funds into offshore accounts that Douglas controlled. Video files of their meetings recorded by my father as insurance, where they discussed everything from forging documents to creating fake companies to frame me. Douglas's voice came through crystal clear on those recordings, calm and calculating as he instructed my father on exactly how to manipulate his own daughters for profit. "The key is making them doubt themselves," Douglas said in one video. "Make Amber think she's the problem, that she's ungrateful, that she owes the family everything. Make Madison think she's powerless, that her only value is in cooperation. Control the narrative and you control their choices." Hearing him describe the psychological warfare they'd waged against us made my hands shake with rage. Patricia's team verified every document, traced every financial transaction, and built a case that would hold up in any courtroom in the country. "This is prosecution gold," she said, spreading papers across the conference table. "Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, money laundering, extortion. Douglas Hale is looking at 20 years minimum if we present this to the FBI. Your father probably 15. But then her expression sobered. However, you need to understand what releasing this will cost you personally. Your family's name will be destroyed. The media will have a field day. Every detail of your grandmother's affair, Madison's parentage, your father's crimes, it'll all be public record. People will dissect your lives, judge you, use your trauma for entertainment. Are you prepared for that? I looked at Madison, who was sitting beside me, pale and exhausted. We'd spent the previous evening really talking for the first time in our lives, crying together over everything that had been stolen from us, mourning the childhood and sisterhood we should have had. She'd moved into the mansion that morning, her few belongings fitting into 2 suitcases because she'd left everything else behind when she fled my father's house. The security system had been upgraded, the property locked down tighter than a military installation. For the first time, we felt safe enough to be honest with each other. "I can handle it," Madison had said when I'd asked her the same question Patricia was asking now. "I've spent my whole life living a lie. Maybe the truth will be painful, but at least it'll be real." I turned back to Patricia. "We release everything," I said. "Full transparency. Douglas thinks he can control the narrative, but we're going to flood the zone with so much documented evidence that he can't spin his way out of it. We go to the FBI, the SEC, the IRS, every regulatory body that might care about financial crimes. We turn him into the story instead of letting him make us the story." Jason nodded approvingly, already making notes about media strategy, about how to position Madison and me as survivors rather than participants. It would work, I thought. It had to work. Because the alternative was letting Douglas Hale continue destroying lives until someone finally stopped him permanently. That's when Patricia pulled one final document from the stack, her expression troubled. "Amber, there's something else on this USB. One document that I think you need to see privately before we proceed." She dismissed the rest of the team, waited until the room cleared, and then slid a single page across the table. It was a contract dated 3 years ago with my signature at the bottom. Except I'd never seen it before in my life. The contract stated that I'd borrowed $200,000 from Douglas Hale, personally agreeing to repay it with interest or forfeit my rights to any inheritance from Eleanor Reynolds. My signature was perfect, notarized, completely legitimate-looking, and completely fabricated. "He's been planning this for years," Patricia said quietly. "If you'd tried to claim the inheritance without knowing about this contract, he would have produced it and sued you for breach. He's built multiple traps, multiple fail-safes. This man doesn't just plan ahead, Amber. He plans for every possible contingency." I stared at my forged signature and realized just how deep Douglas's schemes ran. He hadn't just been manipulating my father. He'd been building a legal cage around me for years, waiting for the perfect moment to spring it. And now that I knew about it, now that I could prove it was fake, he'd lost one of his trump cards. But how many others were out there? How many other forged documents, fabricated debts, manufactured crimes was he preparing to unleash? The battle ahead was going to be even uglier than I'd imagined. Patricia worked through the night with her team, and by morning they'd uncovered something that made my blood run cold. Buried deep in the email correspondence between Douglas and my father was a thread from nearly 15 years ago when I was barely 20 years old and still in college. Douglas had been planning even then, strategizing about how to gain control of grandmother's assets through her grandchildren rather than through direct legal action. "The older girl shows more promise," Douglas had written to my father in one email. "She's ambitious, hardworking, desperate for approval. We can use that. Get her involved in family business decisions, make her feel important, then gradually shift financial responsibility onto her shoulders. By the time Eleanor dies, Amber will be so entangled in the family finances that we can manipulate her signature onto anything we need." But my father had responded with concerns. "Amber's too independent. Eleanor's been encouraging her to study abroad to build a life away from the family. I'm losing control of her." And then a few months later, Douglas's response. "Fine. Focus on Madison instead. The younger one is more malleable. We'll keep Amber at arm's length until we need her, then bring her back when she's vulnerable enough to manipulate. I read those words 3 times, trying to process the fact that I'd been Douglas Hale's primary target before Madison, that the only reason I'd escaped his initial attention was because grandmother had literally sent me to another continent to study. The scholarship to that university in London that I'd thought was based on my academic merit had actually been funded by grandmother through an anonymous donor program. She'd paid to get me out of the country away from Douglas's reach, and I'd never even known. There were other documents, too, showing how grandmother had systematically protected me without my knowledge. She'd paid off my student loans anonymously. She'd deposited money into my account during financial emergencies, always from sources I couldn't trace back to her. She'd even hired a private investigator to follow me for 2 years to make sure Douglas wasn't trying to make contact. Every move she'd made had been calculated to keep me independent, to make sure I built a life that didn't depend on family money or family approval, so that when the time came and Douglas made his play, I'd be strong enough to fight back. The manipulation had been protective rather than exploitative, but it was manipulation nonetheless, and I didn't know whether to feel grateful or angry that she'd controlled so much of my life without telling me. Amber, there's more. Patricia pulled up another set of files, these ones dated within the last 6 months. Press releases that had never been published, written by a PR firm Douglas had hired. They told a story about me that was pure fiction. Amber Reynolds' troubled daughter who'd been fired from multiple jobs for ethical violations. Amber Reynolds who'd stolen from family accounts to fund a gambling addiction. Amber Reynolds who'd manipulated her elderly grandmother into changing her will while the poor woman was dying and confused. Every accusation was carefully crafted to be just plausible enough that people might believe it, supported by forged documents and manufactured evidence. He was going to release these the moment you tried to claim the inheritance, Patricia explained. Flood the media with accusations, make you spend all your time defending yourself instead of attacking him. Classic reputation destruction tactics. Jason was already on his phone calling contacts at major news outlets trying to get ahead of whatever Douglas might be planning, but we were too late. At exactly noon, my phone started buzzing with notifications, news alerts. Social media mentions messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all asking the same question. Was it true? I pulled up the first link with shaking hands and saw my face plastered across a local news website. Heiress accused of financial fraud. Family claims beloved grandmother was manipulated. The article was everything Douglas had threatened and more, painting me as a conniving gold digger who'd isolated my grandmother in her final years and coerced her into disinheriting the rest of the family. My father was quoted extensively, his words dripping with fake concern. "We just want justice for my mother," he said. "Amber has always been troubled, and we tried to help her, but she's gone too far this time." The story was already spreading, picked up by larger outlets, shared thousands of times on social media. People who'd never met me were commenting on my character, calling me names, demanding I be investigated. Within an hour, there were 3 more articles from different sources, all telling slight variations of the same story. Douglas had orchestrated a coordinated media attack, and we'd walked right into it. My phone wouldn't stop ringing, reporters wanting statements, former colleagues asking if the allegations were true, even people from my high school crawling out of the woodwork with, "I always knew there was something off about her" comments. Jason was trying to manage the crisis, drafting responses, reaching out to friendly journalists, but the damage was done. In the court of public opinion, I was already guilty. Madison found me in my office staring at my laptop screen where my face was frozen in an unflattering photo from someone's Facebook page used to illustrate an article about elder abuse. "They're doing to you what they did to me," she said quietly, sitting down beside me. "Making you the villain so no one will believe you when you tell the truth." She was right. This was exactly the playbook Douglas and my father had perfected over decades. Control the narrative. Poison the well. Make sure your victims look crazy or criminal before they can expose you. I was about to respond when the TV in the corner, which had been muted, caught my attention. My face was on the screen, and the chyron at the bottom read, "Breaking local woman accused of embezzling from elderly grandmother's estate." The news anchor's expression was grave, as she detailed the allegations, showing photos of the mansion of grandmother of my father, looking appropriately devastated. They'd moved faster than I'd anticipated, turned their threats into headlines, and now I was fighting for my reputation with one hand, while trying to build a legal case with the other. Douglas had declared war, and his opening salvo had hit exactly where he'd aimed, right at my credibility. If no one believed me, nothing else mattered. He'd win by default. The media firestorm consumed the next 72 hours of my life. Every morning brought fresh headlines, each one more sensational than the last. Reynolds' heiress lavishes fortune while family struggles. Grandmother's deathbed wishes ignored by greedy granddaughter. The comment sections were vicious, filled with strangers who felt entitled to judge every aspect of my life based on lies fed to them by my father and Douglas. Some people defended me, pointing out the lack of actual evidence, but they were drowned out by the mob mentality that loved nothing more than tearing down a woman who'd inherited wealth. Jason worked around the clock, managing the response, carefully placing stories about my career achievements, my years of charitable donations, the fact that I'd worked 3 jobs through college despite coming from a supposedly wealthy family. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough that some outlets started asking harder questions about my father's accusations. The invitations came flooding in within days. Morning talk shows wanted me to tell my side of the story. News programs offered primetime interviews. Even a podcast host who specialized in family drama reached out with what she called an opportunity to set the record straight. Jason compiled them all in a folder and presented them to me with his recommendation. "Normally, I'd say take the biggest platform and own the narrative," he said, tapping the folder. "But in this case, I think silence is more powerful. You're a woman in your 30s who inherited money from a grandmother who loved you. If you go on TV crying and defending yourself, you look weak. If you stay silent and dignified while your work speaks for itself, you look strong. People respect strength, especially women over 50, who've spent their lives watching other women get torn apart in the media for showing emotion." I took his advice, declining every interview request with the same statement through my lawyer. "Miss Reynolds is focused on honoring her grandmother's memory through continued charitable work and will not be participating in media speculation about private family matters." It was simple, classy, and apparently infuriating to the outlets who'd been hoping for drama. But it worked. The story started losing steam when I wouldn't feed it, when I refused to play the role they'd written for me. Madison, however, wanted blood. She paced my office like a caged animal, her frustration palpable. "We have everything we need to destroy them," she said for the 10th time that day. "The USB has proof of everything Douglas and Dad have done. We release it, they go to prison, and this nightmare ends. Why are we waiting?" I understood. Her rage, felt it myself every time I saw my father's face on television playing the wounded parent. But I also understood something Madison didn't yet releasing, that evidence wouldn't just destroy Douglas and our father. It would destroy her too. Every news outlet would pick up the story of her parentage, of grandmother's affair, of the decades of blackmail and manipulation. Madison would go from being my father's daughter to being Douglas Hale's abandoned bastard child in the public consciousness. The trauma of having her entire identity exposed and dissected would be devastating. "We need to be strategic," I told her. "Douglas thinks he's untouchable because he's rich and connected and good at manipulating the system. But everyone has a weakness. His is ego. He can't resist showing people how smart he is, how he's always 3 steps ahead. That arrogance is going to be his downfall." I'd been studying Douglas through the emails and videos, learning how he thought, what motivated him. He'd spent 30 years nursing a grudge because grandmother had wounded his pride. He'd built an empire through legitimate and illegitimate means, and his reputation as a shrewd investor was everything to him. What would happen? I wondered if that reputation was threatened not through criminal charges, but through public humiliation. What if I could make him look foolish instead of criminal, make him so angry that he'd make mistakes? Patricia had been skeptical when I first proposed the idea, but the more we discussed it, the more she'd warm to the strategy. "You want to bait him into a confrontation," she'd said. "Make him think he's won, then pull the rug out in the most public way possible." Exactly. And I knew exactly how to do it. Douglas had demanded a meeting, a chance to negotiate, and I was going to give him one. But not on his terms. On mine, in a place of my choosing, with witnesses and recordings, and a trap so perfectly constructed he wouldn't see it closing until it was too late. I called Margaret and had her send a message through the legal channels Douglas would be monitoring. "Miss Reynolds agrees to meet and discuss settlement terms. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Lighthouse Point Cafe." It was a public location, busy enough that Douglas wouldn't try anything violent, but quiet enough that we could talk. Most importantly, it had cameras everywhere, and I'd already arranged for additional recording equipment. Whatever happened in that meeting would be documented from multiple angles. Madison looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're actually going to sit down with him after everything he's done." But I saw understanding dawn in Patricia's eyes. She knew what I was planning. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator was to let him think you were prey right up until the moment you revealed you'd been the hunter all along. Douglas Hale had spent 30 years playing chess with my family. Tomorrow, I was going to show him that some of us had learned to play the game too. I arrived at Lighthouse Point Cafe 30 minutes early, claiming the corner table with clear sight lines to every entrance and exit. Marcus sat 3 tables away, pretending to work on his laptop, but I knew he was watching every person who entered. Patricia's tech specialist had already confirmed the cafe's security cameras were functioning, and we'd positioned 2 additional recording devices disguised as everyday items. Everything Douglas said would be captured from multiple angles, admissible in court if needed. I ordered coffee I had no intention of drinking and waited, keeping my hands steady through sheer force of will. Douglas arrived exactly on time, which didn't surprise me. Punctuality was a power move for men like him, a way of showing they controlled their schedule down to the minute. He wore another expensive suit, this one charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, and his smile was warm and paternal as he approached my table. To any observer, we looked like a mentor meeting a young professional, not a predator confronting his prey. "Amber," he said, extending his hand like we were old friends. I didn't take it. Just gestured to the chair across from me and watched his smile tighten fractionally at the rejection. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said, settling into his seat with practiced ease. "I was hoping we could resolve this unpleasantness without further escalation. Your father and I have been discussing reasonable terms for asset division that would benefit everyone involved." His tone was conciliatory, reasonable, the voice of a man trying to help rather than hurt. But I'd heard that same tone in the recordings right before he'd instructed my father on how to psychologically torture his own daughters. "I'm not here to negotiate with my father," I said, keeping my voice level and cold. "I'm here to tell you that you're going to withdraw every accusation you've made against me in the media. You're going to disappear from my family's life permanently, or I'm going to destroy you using the evidence Madison gave me." I pulled a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Inside were printouts of the most damaging email screenshots of bank transfers, still frames from the video recordings. Enough to show him I had everything. Douglas barely glanced at the papers. "You won't release those," he said with absolute confidence, "because doing so would destroy Madison's life along with mine. It would reveal that your beloved grandmother had an affair, that she abandoned her own child out of shame. It would make your entire family look corrupt and dysfunctional. You're not ruthless enough for that kind of scorched earth tactic, Amber. Your grandmother raised you to be kind, to protect people, to sacrifice yourself for others. It's your defining characteristic and your greatest weakness." I'd expected this argument and prepared for it. "You're right that I'm kind," I said quietly. "But you've made a fundamental miscalculation about what that means." I leaned forward, holding his pale blue gaze with my own. Kind doesn't mean weak. It means I tried every other option first. I tried reasoning with my father. I tried protecting my family's privacy. I tried giving you a chance to walk away with some dignity. You've rejected every opportunity I've offered because you think compassion equals cowardice. That's where you're wrong. Something flickered in Douglas's expression, the first crack in his composure. "You're bluffing," he said, but he sounded less certain now. "I'm not." I pulled a USB drive from my pocket, identical to the one Madison had stolen, except for one crucial difference. This contains copies of everything Madison took from my father's computer. Bank records, emails, videos, all of it. I'm giving you a chance to review it to understand exactly what we have, and then you're going to make a choice. Walk away now, or force me to take this to every law enforcement agency and media outlet in the country. Douglas took the USB with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll have my people review it," he said, standing up. "But Amber, you should understand something. I've been playing this game since before you were born. I've survived investigations, lawsuits, federal probes. Whatever you think you have, I promise you it's not enough." He slipped the drive into his pocket and turned to leave, and I felt my heart hammering because this was it. This was the moment everything hinged on. He made it 3 steps before he pulled out his phone, and I knew he was plugging the USB into a portable reader to see what was on it. Patricia's tech specialist had assured me this would work, that Douglas's arrogance would make him check the drive immediately rather than waiting for his team to examine it. I watched his face as the files loaded, watched confusion replace confidence as he realized what he was seeing. The USB wasn't just a copy of the evidence. It was a Trojan horse programmed to send an automatic alert to an FBI field office the moment it was accessed, tagged with Douglas's phone number, GPS coordinates, and a message, "Unauthorized access to evidence in federal investigation." Douglas's face went white as his phone started receiving notifications, automated messages from a system he couldn't shut down. He spun back toward me, rage replacing the calculated charm. "What did you do?" "I gave the FBI everything 3 days ago," I said calmly. "That USB isn't evidence. It's a tracking device, and you just told them exactly where to find you." I stood up, gathering my things. "I learned from the best Douglas. You taught my family how to set traps. I'm just better at it than you expected." Through the cafe window, I could already see unmarked vehicles pulling into the parking lot, and Douglas saw them too. The trap had sprung perfectly, and the predator finally understood he'd been the prey all along. Douglas's panic was immediate and visceral. I watched him fumble with his phone, trying to delete files, disconnect from the network, anything to stop what had already been set in motion. But Patricia's tech specialist had designed the trap to be irreversible. The moment Douglas accessed that USB, it had transmitted not just an alert, but a complete data package to the FBI, his location, his device ID metadata from his phone, that proved he was in possession of evidence related to an ongoing investigation. Every frantic action he took to cover his tracks was being logged and transmitted in real time, creating a digital trail that would be impossible to deny in court. The FBI agents who entered the cafe were professional and efficient. They didn't arrest Douglas immediately, just politely asked him to accompany them for questioning regarding financial crimes. Douglas had enough self-preservation instinct left to go quietly, but the look he shot me over his shoulder was pure hatred. He'd finally realized he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd considered beneath his notice, and the humiliation was probably worse than the legal consequences. Marcus walked me to my car, and I drove home with my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. The adrenaline that had kept me calm during the confrontation was draining away, leaving me hollow and exhausted. What I hadn't told Douglas was that my meeting with the FBI had happened the week before, arranged through Patricia's connections in the federal prosecutor's office. I'd given them everything from grandmother's safe, along with Madison's USB spending hours, in a secure facility, walking agents through decades of financial crimes. The case they'd built was massive, sprawling across multiple jurisdictions, and involving not just Douglas and my father, but several other business associates who'd participated in their schemes. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, had been particularly interested in some offshore accounts that connected Douglas to an international money laundering operation. "We've been looking for a way into this network for years," she'd told me. "Your evidence might be the key that breaks it open." The next 3 months were a blur of legal proceedings and media coverage. Douglas hired the best lawyers money could buy, but the evidence against him was overwhelming and multifaceted. The financial fraud charges alone could have put him away for decades, but it was the international warrant that destroyed any chance of bail. Apparently, Douglas had fled Singapore 10 years ago after being accused of embezzling from a business partner, and Interpol had been watching for him ever since. The FBI's investigation had triggered alerts in multiple countries, and suddenly, Douglas wasn't just facing American justice, but extradition requests from 3 different nations. I followed the news coverage, but tried to keep my distance emotionally. Jason managed the PR side, carefully positioning me as a victim who'd bravely exposed corruption, rather than a vindictive heiress seeking revenge. Public opinion had shifted dramatically once the FBI's evidence became public. The same people who'd called me a gold digger were now praising my courage. It felt hollow, the approval of strangers who'd been so quick to condemn me, but I understood the necessity of managing perception. The arrest happened at San Francisco International Airport on a gray Tuesday morning in late October. Douglas had apparently decided to flee, rather than face trial booking a private charter to a country without extradition treaties. But the FBI had been monitoring his movements since the day I'd handed over the evidence, and they were waiting when he arrived at the private terminal. The news footage showed him in handcuffs being led across the tarmac, and for just a moment the camera caught his face. He looked old, suddenly diminished, nothing like the polished predator who'd threatened me in that abandoned beach house. I watched the footage in my office with Madison beside me, and neither of us felt the triumph I'd expected. Just a tired relief that the most dangerous enemy was finally neutralized. My father was arrested the same afternoon, picked up at his house by local police executing a federal warrant. Unlike Douglas, my father didn't try to run. According to the police report he'd been expecting them, had actually seemed relieved when they arrived. He was charged with fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and a dozen other crimes that would likely keep him in prison for a significant portion of whatever life he had left. I thought that would be the end of it, that I could finally start moving forward, without looking over my shoulder. Then Margaret called with a message I hadn't anticipated. "Your father has requested to see you," she said carefully. "He's being held pending trial, and he's asked specifically for you to visit him. You're under no obligation to go, Amber. After everything he's done, no one would blame you for refusing." But even as she said it, I knew I would go. Not because I owed him anything, but because I needed to look him in the eye one last time and close this chapter of my life completely. Some conversations couldn't be avoided, only postponed, and I was tired of running from difficult truths. The county jail visiting room smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. I sat at one of the metal tables bolted to the floor and waited for them to bring my father in my hands, folded calmly in my lap, even though my heart was racing. When the door finally opened and he shuffled through in his orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed in front of him, I felt nothing. No anger, no sympathy, no residual longing for the father I'd never really had. He was just a man who'd made terrible choices, and those choices had finally caught up with him. He sat down across from me and immediately tried to straighten his posture to project the authority he'd once wielded over our family like a weapon. But the effect was ruined by the handcuffs, by the institutional clothing, by the way his eyes kept darting to the guards standing by the door. "Amber," he said, and his voice had that same tone he'd used when I was a child being scolded for some imagined slight. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." As if he were doing me a favor by allowing me to visit, as if I should be grateful for his attention even now. "I'm here because I have questions," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "And because I wanted to see you one more time before you spend the next 15 years in prison." His jaw tightened at the reminder of his sentence, but he recovered quickly, sliding into the victim role he'd perfected over decades. "None of this was supposed to happen," he said, leaning forward as much as the cuffs would allow. "I was trying to protect this family. Douglas manipulated me, Amber. He preyed on my financial struggles, convinced me that your grandmother was being unfair to all of us. I thought I was securing our future, making sure we'd all be taken care of. Everything I did for you and Madison." The lie was so brazen, so thoroughly contradicted by mountains of evidence that I almost laughed. You stole from your own mother for 30 years. You used both your daughters as pawns in financial schemes. You tried to have me framed for crimes you committed. Which part of that was protecting us? You don't understand the pressure I was under," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "The debts, the expectations, trying to maintain a lifestyle your mother demanded. I made mistakes, yes, but my intentions were good. I loved your mother once. I loved you. You have to believe that." I looked at him carefully, studying the face that had loomed over my childhood like a storm cloud, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Whatever capacity for love existed in him had been so twisted and corrupted that it bore no resemblance to anything real. "If you loved me," I said quietly, "why did you steal my identity? Why did you destroy my credit? Why did you spend 20 years making me feel worthless unless I was giving you money?" He had answers ready, excuses polished from years of practice. I was going to pay it back. I was desperate. You were the only one I could turn to. But his words rang hollow, scripted, the performance of a man who'd lied for so long he could no longer distinguish truth from fiction. "Then tell me this," I said, leaning forward. "Why did you do all those things to Madison? She was just a child when you started putting debt in her name. She trusted you completely. If you loved us, if you were trying to protect us, why did you torture the daughter who thought you were her hero?" The question landed like a physical blow. My father's mouth opened, then closed. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and in that silence I found my answer. He'd never loved any of us. Not me, not Madison, not my mother, not even his own mother, who'd spent decades trying to protect her family from him. We'd all been resources to him, tools to be used and discarded when we stopped being useful. The realization should have hurt, but instead it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. I stood up the chair, scraping against the concrete floor. "I forgive you," I said, and watched his face light up with hope that I immediately crushed. "But I won't forget. I forgive you because holding on to anger would give you power over me even from prison, and I'm done letting you control any part of my life. But I won't forget what you did, won't pretend it didn't happen, won't let you rewrite history into something more palatable. You made your choices. Now you live with the consequences." "Amber, wait." He started to rise, but the guard was already moving forward. "You can't just leave. I'm your father. You owe me—" "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I never did. Goodbye." I walked out of that visiting room without looking back, and with each step I felt lighter, like I was shedding weights I'd carried so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The anger I'd nursed for 35 years had burned itself out, leaving behind something cleaner and stronger. I was free of him. Finally, completely free. Madison was waiting in the hallway outside, her face anxious. "How did it go?" she asked, and I could see she was braced for me to fall apart, to need comfort after confronting the man who'd damaged us both so thoroughly. But I just smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. "It went exactly how it needed to," I said. "He's not our father anymore. He's just a man who made terrible choices. And we're the women who survived him." Madison's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling too. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I should have told you weeks ago." And I knew somehow that whatever came next would change everything again. We found a quiet bench in the courthouse garden, away from the reporters and lawyers and endless procedural machinery of justice. Madison sat with her hands twisted in her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so raw it made my chest ache. "I've hated myself for years," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I envied you so much it poisoned everything. You were strong, you were independent. Grandmother loved you in a way she never loved me. At least that's what I thought. But the truth is, I was just jealous of your courage. You got away from him, Amber. You built a life that didn't revolve around his approval. And I couldn't do that because I was too afraid. Every time I thought about standing up to him, about saying no, I'd remember that he could destroy me with one conversation. He could tell me the truth about who I really was and take away the only identity I'd ever known. I pulled her into my arms, and we sat there holding each other the way sisters should have been holding each other for decades. Two lost children who'd finally found their way home to each other. "You weren't weak," I told her fiercely. "You were surviving. There's a difference between weakness and being trapped, and you were trapped from the day you were born. None of what happened to you was your fault." She pulled back, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand. "But I hurt you. For years I said terrible things, I participated in his games, I let him turn us against each other when we should have been allies. I need to confess that, Amber. The prosecutors should know I wasn't just a victim, I was complicit in some of it." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "You were 16 when he started using you for fraud. You were a minor under his control, manipulated and coerced. Any confession you make will be used to reduce his sentence, not to get you justice. I won't let you destroy yourself trying to claim responsibility for his crimes." This was what grandmother had wanted, I realized. Not revenge, not destruction, but protection. She'd built her fortress of evidence not to tear our family apart, but to give us the tools to defend ourselves while minimizing collateral damage. We spent the next week working with Patricia and the prosecutors, carefully reviewing every piece of evidence before it was submitted. There were documents that implicated our mother in ways that were technically criminal, but practically coerced. We removed those, explained the context, made sure the narrative reflected that she'd been another victim of my father's systematic abuse. There were details about Madison's parentage that weren't relevant to the criminal case, and we fought to keep those sealed. The prosecutors resisted at first, wanting everything public, but Patricia was relentless in arguing that Madison's privacy was protected under multiple statutes and that her biological origins had no bearing on the fraud charges. When we finally told our mother what we'd done, how we'd protected her even after her betrayals, she broke down completely. "I don't deserve this," she sobbed. "I don't deserve either of you." And she was right in a way. But forgiveness wasn't about what people deserved. It was about what we needed to do to move forward without carrying their mistakes on our backs forever. We were choosing to be better than the people who'd hurt us, and that felt like its own kind of victory. 3 days after the final evidence submission, Margaret called with news that made my hands go numb. "Amber, I've been going through the last of your grandmother's legal documents, and there's something I missed in the initial review. Your grandmother left you one more asset." Her voice was strange, careful in a way that suggested whatever she was about to tell me was significant. "It's not monetary. It's a property, but not like the mansion. This is different. This is something your grandmother built 40 years ago and kept completely separate from everything else. She left specific instructions that you only learn about it after your father's arrest, after the immediate danger had passed. I think you need to come to my office. There's someone here who can explain better than I can. Someone your grandmother trusted with a secret she's been keeping for decades." I looked at Madison, whose expression mirrored my confusion and curiosity, and we both knew that even now, even after everything, grandmother was still revealing layers of protection and planning we hadn't known existed. Whatever this asset was, it was important enough to hide until we were strong enough to receive it. The woman waiting in Margaret's office was in her 70s, with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she held a manila folder. She introduced herself as Helen Castellano, and she'd been my grandmother's friend for over 40 years. "Eleanor made me promise not to contact you until certain conditions were met," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "Until your father was no longer a threat, until you'd found your strength. She knew this gift would only make sense to you once you understood what it cost her to build it." The folder contained deeds to a 3-story brick building in a neighborhood I recognized from my childhood photos of the interior, showing large open rooms with high ceilings and good light, and a letter in my grandmother's handwriting that made my vision blur with tears before I'd read 3 sentences. "My dearest Amber, if you're reading this, you've survived everything I feared would destroy you. You've faced down the monsters I couldn't defeat, and you've emerged stronger. Now I want to give you something more valuable than money or property. Though technically this gift is both. This building was my sanctuary for 15 years, a place where I ran support groups for women like me, women whose families had abandoned them, abused them, stolen from them. Women who needed a safe space to remember they were more than their trauma. I looked up at Helen, who nodded. Your grandmother started the program in the 1980s after her marriage to your grandfather ended badly. He'd been controlling, financially abusive, and when she finally left him, she had resources most women didn't. She wanted to use those resources to help others escape similar situations. For 15 years, she ran weekly meetings in that building, offering everything from legal advice to job training to just a place where women could talk without judgment. Why did she stop? Madison asked quietly, reading over my shoulder. Because your father found out about it. Helen said, her expression darkening. He threatened to expose some of the women attending, claimed they were using the center for illegal activities. Eleanor knew it was a lie, but she also knew he had the connections to make life very difficult for vulnerable women who were trying to rebuild. So she closed the center to protect them, but she never sold the building. She kept it maintained, kept it ready, waiting for someone she trusted to continue the work. The letter continued. I want you to continue what I dreamed but didn't have the strength to finish. Not because you owe me anything, Amber, but because I think you understand now what these women need. You've been where they are, trapped, exploited, made to feel worthless by people who should have loved you. You know what it takes to break free, and you know how desperately we need spaces where women can remember their own power. The strongest woman isn't one who takes revenge, but one who uses her pain to heal others. Be that woman, my darling girl. Build what I couldn't protect. I pressed the letter against my chest, feeling grandmother's love radiating through every carefully chosen word. This was why she'd fought so hard to protect her assets, why she'd built that fortress of evidence and legal protections. Not just to give me wealth, but to give me purpose. The mansion could house women, temporarily providing safety and stability. The community center could offer programs, resources, a gathering place. Together, they could become something transformative, something that would help dozens or hundreds of women reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them. I want to do this, I said, looking at Madison. I want to turn both properties into a comprehensive support center. Housing, counseling, job, training, legal assistance, everything women need to escape abuse and rebuild independently. Madison's face lit up with understanding, and I saw in her expression that she knew this was right, that this was how we honored grandmother's memory and our own survival. We spent the next 2 months planning, hiring staff, renovating spaces, building partnerships with local organizations that served vulnerable women. The grand opening was scheduled for a quiet Saturday morning, nothing flashy or public, just a small gathering to mark the beginning of something important. I stood on the steps of the community center building, looking at the sign we'd hung above the door, Eleanor's Place, and felt more at peace than I had in my entire life. That's when the elderly woman approached, walking slowly up the path with a cane for support. She was small and frail-looking, but her eyes were sharp and determined. When she reached me, she smiled. "You must be Amber," she said. "Your grandmother sent me." My heart stopped. My grandmother passed away almost a year ago. The woman's smile deepened. "I know, dear. But 3 years ago, when she knew her time was limited, she wrote me a letter. Told me that someday her granddaughter would open a center for women, and when that day came, I should be the first one to walk through those doors. She said you'd understand why." The woman's name was Ruth, and she invited me inside my own building to tell me a story I'd never heard. We sat in what would soon be the main gathering room, surrounded by fresh paint and new furniture, and she pulled from her handbag a leather notebook so worn the edges had gone soft. "Your grandmother gave this to me the last time I saw her, about 6 months before she passed," Ruth explained, handling the notebook like it was sacred. "She said, 'When my granddaughter opens the center, give her this. She'll need to understand that what we build together is bigger than money or property. It's about creating ripples that extend far beyond what we can see.'" Inside the notebook were pages and pages of names, dates, and brief notations in grandmother's handwriting. Sarah M., 1984, escaped abusive marriage, now runs her own accounting firm. Jennifer P., 1987, custody battle, 3 children, now child advocate. Patricia K., 1991, financial abuse recovery, founded nonprofit for elder women. The list went on for dozens of pages, chronicling women grandmother had helped over 15 years of running her support groups. Some entries had updates spanning decades showing how grandmother had kept track of these women long after they'd left her program, documenting their success stories like a gardener tracking the growth of seeds she'd planted. "There are 73 women on that list," Ruth said quietly. "And I've been in contact with 42 of them since your grandmother passed. They all want to help with the new center, either through donations, volunteering, or professional services. Your grandmother created a network of strong women who never forgot what she did for them, and now they want to pay it forward through you." She pulled out a stack of letters, handwritten notes from women across the country, expressing gratitude and offering support. Some were from the women themselves, others from their daughters or granddaughters who'd heard the stories and wanted to contribute. The legacy grandmother had built wasn't just material. It was a living web of compassion and strength that had been growing quietly for 40 years. I read through the letters with tears streaming down my face, understanding finally the true scope of what grandmother had been trying to tell me. The mansion, the money, the evidence against my father, those were just tools. The real inheritance was this: the knowledge that one person's compassion could change dozens of lives, and those lives could touch hundreds more, creating ripples that extended far beyond what any single person could accomplish alone. Grandmother hadn't just protected me from my father's cruelty. She'd shown me how to transform that cruelty into something generative and healing. At the bottom of the notebook, tucked into a pocket I almost missed, was one final letter addressed to me in grandmother's handwriting. My hands shook as I unfolded it, and Ruth quietly excused herself to give me privacy. "Amber, you don't just deserve love, you are the one who brings light. I've watched you your entire life, seen how you give and give even when you receive nothing in return, and I've worried that you'd mistake your capacity for love as weakness. But it's not weakness, my darling. It's the rarest kind of strength. You have the ability to break cycles of harm to create safety, where there was fear to build community, where there was isolation. That's not something that can be taught or inherited through DNA. It's something you chose to cultivate in yourself, despite every reason to become bitter and closed. I'm so proud of you. I'm so grateful I got to know you. And I'm so confident that you'll take what I've started and make it into something even more beautiful than I could imagine. You are my greatest legacy, not because of what you'll do with the money I left you, but because of who you already are." I sat in that empty room holding grandmother's words against my heart, feeling decades of unworthiness finally dissolve. She'd seen me, really truly seen me. Not as a resource or a burden or a disappointment, but as someone capable of bringing light into dark places. The validation I'd spent 35 years searching for in my father's approval had been here all along, preserved in grandmother's careful handwriting, waiting for the moment when I was strong enough to believe it. My phone rang, shattering the sacred quiet. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and I almost let it go to voicemail before remembering that calls from lawyers rarely brought good news that could wait. "Amber, I need to tell you something about your father's case," she said without preamble, her voice tight with something I couldn't identify. "There's been a development, a significant one. Can you come to my office right away?" Margaret's news wasn't what I expected. My father's plea deal had been finalized 15 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 10. The judge would be sentencing in 2 weeks, and as the primary victim, I had the right to submit an impact statement that would be read in court. "Most victims in your situation use this opportunity to advocate for maximum sentencing," Margaret explained, sliding the paperwork across her desk. "But you have another option. There's a restorative justice program the court sometimes approves for nonviolent offenders. It allows for reduced sentences in exchange for accountability therapy and community service. Given your father's age and health issues, he might qualify if you are willing to advocate for it." The idea should have repulsed me. After everything he'd done, the thought of asking for leniency seemed like a betrayal of myself and Madison, and every woman he'd hurt. But as I sat with it, I realized that keeping him in prison for 15 years wouldn't heal anything. It would just be another cycle of punishment and pain, and I was tired of pain. What would the conditions be? I asked quietly. We spent the next week crafting a proposal that felt right. My father would serve 5 years, followed by 10 years of supervised release, during which he'd be required to attend therapy, make public acknowledgement of his crimes without minimizing or deflecting, and volunteer at Eleanor's place, helping with administrative work under strict supervision. He'd never be alone with clients, never have access to finances, but he'd have to face daily the kind of women he'd spent his life exploiting. The punishment wouldn't be time in a cell. It would be accountability, proximity to the harm he'd caused, and the slow, difficult work of becoming someone different. The judge approved the proposal, and my father accepted the terms with what looked like genuine shock that I'd offered him any mercy at all. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing, didn't need to see his face or hear his lawyer's spin on redemption and second chances. I'd said everything I needed to say in that jail visiting room months ago. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of world I wanted to help create. One afternoon in early spring, I stood on the balcony of the mansion looking out at the ocean that had witnessed so many turning points in my journey. The waves were gentle today, sparkling in sunlight that felt like a blessing. I'd been living here for just over a year, and the house had transformed from a fortress into something warmer. Madison had moved into one of the guest suites permanently, and her presence had brought life and laughter into rooms that had felt too empty for just me. We'd started having dinner together most nights, cooking meals and talking about everything we'd missed during the decades we'd been strangers. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Madison carrying 2 mugs of tea, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," she said, handing me a cup, "about what I want to do with my life now that I'm not just surviving anymore. I want to work at this center, not as a volunteer, but as staff. I want to help run the programs, work with the women, use everything I learned from being trapped to help others escape." Her voice was steady, certain. "We survived the same poison, just in different doses. Maybe that means we can help heal it together." I pulled her into a hug, my sister and my aunt and my ally, all wrapped into one complicated, beautiful person. "I'd love that," I whispered. "Grandmother would love that too." And I knew it was true. Everything she'd planned, every protection she'd built, every secret she'd kept, it had all been leading to this moment. 2 women who'd been pitted against each other their entire lives, finally standing together, ready to use their pain to create something healing. We stood there looking out at the ocean, at the mansion that represented both everything we'd lost and everything we'd gained, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at my father. Not at my mother. Not even at Douglas Hale rotting in a prison cell waiting for extradition. They'd taken so much from us, stolen years we could never recover, but they hadn't broken us. We'd bent, we'd nearly shattered, but we'd survived. And now we were going to make sure other women survived too. Madison squeezed my hand. "Ready to change some lives?" she asked with a smile that looked like hope. I smiled back, feeling lighter than I had in 35 years, finally free of the weight I'd carried for so long. The mansion behind us, the center waiting in the city, the network of strong women grandmother had built it, was all part of a legacy that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with resilience. I wasn't the broken daughter anymore, and Madison wasn't the trapped princess. We were survivors building something that mattered, and that felt like the truest kind of victory. "Let's help more women," I said softly, and meant it with every fiber of my being. If Amber's story moved you, if you felt her pain and celebrated her triumph, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family? How did you find the strength to rebuild? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you want more stories about women who refused to stay victims, who turned their pain into power and their trauma into purpose, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. These aren't just stories, they're reminders that we're stronger than the people who tried to break us, that kindness isn't weakness, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing that we all deserve better than what broke us. I'll see you in the next story.